I will be completely honest with you guys. I had so much stuff planned for April for this Canadian election cycle. I've got stuff prepped for a video about China's influence in Canada, Canada's messy relationship with free speech principles, the problems with Canada's healthcare system, including the disastrous rollout of the voluntary euthanasia program, issues with Native Canadians, the Aboriginal stuff, and of course, the big one. But you know what? I got lazy. Yeah, that's it. There's no secret, there's no deeper truth. I've done some work on all these projects, but for example, I swear to God I've sunk 100 hours into that Blue Prince game that came out recently, and I'm not even sure it's even been out for 100 hours at the time of recording. What can I say? I'm a gamer at heart. Maybe some of these topics will be interesting in the future. After all, I don't want the work I put into them to go to waste. But if we're going to be talking about the Canadian election coming up on April 28th, 2025, I should at least discuss how Canada got to the disastrous position that it's currently in. However, I do understand that the majority of my audience are Americans, and you guys probably won't really get it if I jump in feet first. So, before we go any further, I'm gonna have to do a bit of Canadian Civics 101. For any Canucks in the audience, let alone Aussies or Britbongers, yes, I know this is gonna be a bit tedious. Stick with me, okay? Speaking very broadly here, most modern states have three branches of government: the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. The legislative creates law, the judicial judges law, and the executive carries out law. Some countries have more than three branches. For example, some make foreign policy or internal investigations or civil service their own branches, for a whole bunch of different reasons that aren't important right now. But legislative, judicial, and executive are what matter for us today. There's also a whole bunch of different systems that states use to govern themselves. There's the one-party state, where it's written directly in the constitution of that country that only one party is allowed to hold office, like in Communist China or the Soviet Union, or Fascist Italy or Nazi Germany. There's the military junta, where the military directly controls the executive branch, and there's no constitution or courts or legislature capable of checking their power. This type of government is most common in South America or Africa. There's theocracies, where religious leaders control the executive branch, and govern according to religious rather than secular principles. You can see these everywhere in the Middle East. But liberal countries tend to have strict separation of powers between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, where they each have their roles to play, and they're often adversarial towards each other in order to check each other's power. This idea was first described by the English liberal philosopher John Locke, who thought that foreign affairs should be the third branch, not the judiciary. The French liberal Montesquieu substituted foreign affairs with the judiciary in his formulation, and his work was read by and inspired all of the American founding fathers, most notably James Madison, who came up with the American idea of three branches of government. Most liberal countries come in one of two forms: the presidential or congressional system, which America and France use, or the Westminster or parliamentary system, which the UK and Canada and Australia use. They have a few key differences. In the presidential system, citizens vote for representatives to sit in the legislature. They also vote directly or indirectly for the leader of the executive branch, usually a president. And they also may vote for some parts of the judicial branch, usually like low-level local judges. The executive branch appoints people to executive and judicial positions, with oversight and approval of the legislature. What's important, though, is that the leader of the executive derives its authority to rule from a separate source than the members of the legislature, usually through a separate vote. In the parliamentary system, citizens vote for representatives to sit in the legislature, while the judicial branch is appointed at the top, elected at the bottom, just like before. However, this time the executive branch is the monarch, who is not elected. It's a hereditary title. Many Americans believe that this means Canada and Australia and other Commonwealth countries are ruled by the UK, since they all share the same king, Charles III. But this isn't exactly true. When the British Empire dissolved, each country gained its own crown. Charles III might be the king of the UK, but he's also the king of Canada and the king of Australia, which are their own independent positions. And theoretically, Canada and Australia and other sovereign countries could change their laws of succession, so that, for example, their crowns go not to the first child, William, but the second child, Harry, if they wanted to. It's not going to happen, but the point I'm making is, these are separate and independent crowns that all currently sit on the same head, and probably will for quite a while. Of course, the king can't be everywhere at once, so while he's in Canada or Australia or wherever, he performs the duties associated with his position. And while he's not there, which let's be real is most of the time, he appoints a governor-general who wields power in his name. The governor-general has all of the power the king does, and he's often a citizen of high standing who is recommended to the crown for this position by the legislature. And though the crown can refuse the recommendation, they pretty much never do. Unlike in absolute monarchies where the crown directly rules the country, many people view the monarch in democratic or constitutional monarchies as simply a ceremonial figurehead with no actual political power. But this isn't true. For example, when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982, the UK Parliament didn't need to vote on what to do. The Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, acted with the express authority of Queen Elizabeth to retake the islands. Additionally, in Australia in 1975, when Parliament was gridlocked and couldn't pass any legislation at all, the Governor-General unilaterally dismissed the Prime Minister and called an election. Of course, both of these events are more detailed, but the point is, in a liberal democratic country that is also a monarchy, the crown retains some real power and occasionally does use it, though only if necessary in times of emergency. They're basically a reset switch on the government in case things get too dysfunctional. However, this also means that ultimately, the executive has final authority over the legislature. And Republicans, meaning people who prefer republics instead of kingdoms, generally want the legislature to have ultimate authority over the executive. During the normal course of events, after an election is completed, the monarch, or the governor general, invites the leader of the party that wins the most amount of seats in the legislature to form a government. The leader of that party becomes the prime minister. He then chooses other members of parliament to fill his cabinet, like the minister of defense or the finance minister or whatever. And it's these people that basically become the public face of government. They set policy, they pass legislation. The monarch, or the governor general, retains the right to veto any legislation that's passed, but again, they generally don't, and they make executive decisions on the advice of the cabinet. If the largest party has over 50% of the seats in parliament, then forming government isn't a problem. A vote is called, everyone in the party votes to affirm their leader as prime minister, and government is formed. However, if the largest party doesn't have over 50% of the seats, then we have a minority government, where the largest party has to negotiate with one of the smaller parties in order to get enough votes to make it past the halfway mark. Usually this means promising to fulfill some of their agenda. An election is always called once every 5 years after the last election, no matter how popular a party is or how many seats it has. However, if a minority party loses the support of its negotiated allies, then a vote of no confidence can be called. If that vote is successful, Parliament's dissolved, and a snap election is immediately called. And, of course, the Governor-General can call a snap election in times of crisis. Plus, the Prime Minister has the ability to request the Crown call one, which, yes, results in exactly the type of political shenanigans you're thinking about. Because the Prime Minister is the leader of whatever party has the most seats in Parliament, it's actually entirely possible for a Prime Minister to never have been voted into the position. Usually when a general election's coming up, there's already been a previous internal party leadership race, so the public knows who's going to be the head honcho should the party win. For example, David Cameron in the UK, or Justin Trudeau in Canada, were party leaders for several years before becoming Prime Minister, and the voters knew that these were the guys that were going to be leading the country if their party won. However, sometimes when a Prime Minister steps down, and their party still controls Parliament, the party can call a leadership race while retaining power, and the new leader becomes the new Prime Minister despite a general election not having been called. Usually, this new leader is already a member of Parliament, having won a backbench seat in the previous election. Recent examples of this are Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and Rishi Sunak, all in the UK. Even rarer still, though, are where a party controls Parliament, the Prime Minister steps down, the party retains power during the leadership race, and the new leader who wins that leadership race, becoming Prime Minister, doesn't actually have a seat in Parliament. Usually, leaders and parties are also running for seats in Parliament, or they have them, but that's not required. It's possible for a party leader to not have a seat in Parliament at all, and still be leading his party. And if his party is the largest, he becomes the Prime Minister, despite never having been voted in by anyone except members of the party. And though this is pretty rare, we do have one modern example, the current Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. So, my American friends, basically imagine a scenario where your president was not elected, but he inherited the position by birth. He retained some emergency powers, but in day-to-day practice he was far weaker than he currently is. Your Speaker of the House was actually the Prime Minister, and the President's cabinet members, like the Secretary of Defense or Finance Secretary or whatever, they were all selected by the Speaker of the House from members of Congress, and the President was bound by precedent, though not really by law, to follow the advice of these congressmen in the decisions that he makes, again unless it's an emergency. You have all that imagined? Well, that's a parliamentary system in a nutshell. Also, I know this isn't exactly completely accurate, but I am speedrunning through this stuff. This isn't what this video is about. What it is about is how Canada got here, and now we can finally talk about it. Canada tends to really only have one of two types of Prime Minister, at least in the modern era. Either they're caretaker Prime Ministers, who really only last a few months, because they're filling a void after a previous Prime Minister stepped down, and they're pretty much expected to lose the next election. Kim Campbell is the quintessential example of this. In 1993, the Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney stepped down after nearly 9 years in office. Campbell won the leadership race of her party, and she held power for 132 days, before getting absolutely slaughtered by the Liberals under Jean Chrétien.
Gee, I'm glad I didn't sell my car.
It was a humiliating blow for a party that headed into the election with 154 seats. It came out with only 2.
Or they're actual popular prime ministers, who hold office long enough to implement policy. Canada's appetite for any one given prime minister tends to last about a decade or so, excluding historic examples like the Liberal William Lyon Mackenzie King, who lasted 21 years, or the Conservative John A. Macdonald, who lasted 19 years. But in the modern era, Canada's patience tends to run out around the decade mark. Chrétien lasted 10 years, the Conservative Stephen Harper made it to 9.5, Mulroney, like I said, made it to nearly 9. At the end of each of these guys' terms, there was this general feeling among Canadians that they've kind of just had enough and wanted something new. There's one big outlier from this modern trend, and it's Prime Minister Trudeau. No, not that one. That one. Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, was Prime Minister from 1968 to 1979, then had a short break as opposition leader for a year, and then was Prime Minister again from 1980 to 1984. He had 15 years total, and managed to lose a general election, retain leadership of his party, and then go on to win again, which is actually pretty unprecedented in Canadian politics.
Pierre Trudeau has made up his mind. He's decided to postpone his retirement and try instead to make one of this country's most spectacular political comebacks. Trudeau said today he's going to stay on in politics and that he'll try again to become Canada's Prime Minister.
I have accepted the strong appeal of the National Liberal Caucus and the National Liberal Executive, and I will lead our party in the current election campaign.
In the minds of the Canadian population, Pierre Trudeau is considered one of our great prime ministers. He's routinely well regarded as both a known Canadian public figure on the world stage and an example of a good leader, often spoken of alongside more historic figures like Macdonald or Wilfrid Laurier from much earlier in Canada's history. Pierre Trudeau's 15 years in power, his policies, his personality, aren't really that important to this video, so we won't go into super detail on what he was like, but he will come up in a couple of key moments, so keep him in mind. Stephen Harper, Canada's last Conservative Prime Minister, enjoyed 2 minority governments from 2006 to 2011, and 1 majority from 2011 to 2015. Justin Trudeau, Pierre's son, was elected to Liberal Party leadership in 2013 after repeated scandals and failures and corruption, and his campaign for Liberal leadership was marketed as a clean break from the Liberals of old. He won both the leadership race and the general, riding on a wave of left-wing populism, representing a Canadian electorate that was just basically fed up with the stuffy bureaucratic nature of Harper's government. Justin Trudeau wasn't a career politician. He had degrees in liberal arts and education. He was a math teacher at one point. He also has credits in an engineering degree he didn't finish, and he was getting a master's in environmental geography when he decided to drop out and run for party leader. His first adult public appearance was when he gave the eulogy at his father's state funeral in 2000, and a lot of people back then remarked that it felt like he was going to be prime minister one day. In fact, he was often spoken about in his youth as if he had a predestined career in politics due to the incredible success of his father. Even as a baby, President Nixon said he was going to be prime minister. So, when Justin Trudeau took control of the Liberals in 2013, he made a bunch of promises about clearing out the corruption of the old party elite, reforming Canada's first past-the-post voting system, legalizing marijuana. You know, it's all stuff that a bunch of 20-something millennials at the time really wanted, including me. There was basically this air of inevitability surrounding his ascent. We all felt like Stephen Harper was still in power only because an election just hadn't been called yet, and that it was a foregone conclusion that as soon as it happened, the Conservatives would just be washed away. Trudeau-mania, a term used to describe the energy and fervor that surrounded Pierre Trudeau, was revived to describe the similar energy around Justin. Where Harper was a boring bureaucrat, Trudeau was young and good-looking and funny on the mic, and he did celebrity boxing matches and stuff. He felt like the first real Canadian social media politician, the same way that Obama was. And yes, I voted for him in 2015. I know that people like Vosh and other breadtubers have called me a fascist for my contribution to 2014's Gamergate, or hanging out with Sargon or whatever, but I was always a liberal. My Gamergate era stuff was in defense of liberal values in that space. This man right here, this is the Trudeau that I voted for.
Plenty of people will wonder why a political leader would bother giving a speech on a notion such as liberty. After all, our politics are supposed to be retail these days. We're expected to talk about very specific measures targeted at key audiences and swing voters, especially in an election year. But I have an old-fashioned view. I think policies are concrete expressions of values. Priorities are important. Specific commitments are important. But there is no way to predict the events you will have to navigate during your time in office, let alone the measures that will be required to manage those events. People aren't naive, they know that. So Canadians ought to know what core values motivate their leaders' decisions, whatever events may throw at them. And for me, one of the most important core values is liberty. Specifically, I believe that one of the highest aims of Canadian political leadership is to protect and expand freedom for Canadians. I say this not just because the Canadian idea of liberty is important to me, which it is. It has motivated several of the significant policy changes I have brought forward as leader of my party. But it's important to all of us. Our shared commitment to it is the very foundation of the amazing country that we have built together. And I also think it's time that liberals took back liberty. These conservatives pretend to talk a good game about freedom, but look at what they've done with it. They've fallen a long way from the era of Sir John A. Macdonald to the "why do you hate freedom" taunts of the recently departed Sun News Network. Their instincts are now to be suspicious of people who do not share their beliefs, to harden divisions with people whose views differ from their own. In my 7 years in Parliament, I have heard the Conservative Prime Minister accuse 2 different leaders of the NDP of sympathizing with terrorists. The Conservative Party of Canada accused notable McGillian Irwin Cotler of anti-Semitism, and the former Public Safety Minister to declare, "You're either with us or you're with the child pornographers." Yeah, for that particular effort, the Prime Minister eventually rewarded him with a judicial appointment. This, my friends, is not your parents' Conservative Party. Their approach to politics might work in the short term, but it is corrosive over time, especially in a diverse country like Canada. It stokes anxiety and foments fear. Instead of encouraging Canadians to fight for one another's liberty, it tells us to be suspicious of each other's choices. Mr. Harper and I disagree fundamentally about a great many things, but none perhaps more so than this. Leading this country should mean you bring Canadians together. You do not divide them against one another. Fear is a dangerous thing. Once it is sanctioned by the state, there is no telling where it might lead. It is always a short path to walk from being suspicious of our fellow citizens to taking actions to restrict their liberty. And that, to borrow a phrase, is not the way we do things around here.
Of course, it wasn't the Trudeau that I got. That was the Liberal Trudeau. What we instead received was the Progressive Trudeau.
It's an incredible pleasure for me to be here today before you to present to Canada a cabinet that looks like Canada.
I understand one of the priorities for you was to have a cabinet that was gender balanced. Why was that so important to you?
Because it's 2015.
Yeah, the whole current year argument? Trudeau didn't start it, but he certainly helped popularize it. When Trudeau was elected in 2015, across the English-speaking world, the old individual-focused Liberals of the 2000s were being culturally squeezed out in favor of identity politics-focused progressives, a trend which basically continued until, like, right now. And whether it's because he genuinely believed in those values, or he understood that he had to follow the zeitgeist in order to keep power, that is the direction that Trudeau shifted as well. Like with any politician, there are things that Trudeau's done that I support. For example, he promised to legalize marijuana, and he did. I'm not a weed guy at all, but I do think it's silly for a country to allow cigarettes and alcohol, but not weed. All of the normal, common sense restrictions you'd expect apply. Only for adults, can't drive while high, that sort of thing. However, it is kind of funny that the government actually loses money selling weed from the state-owned stores, since they're somehow doing it so inefficiently. Additionally, Trudeau supported the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'll be honest with you, I was against the TPP back in 2015, because frankly, I just didn't know shit about economics back then. This is definitely one of those positions that I've moved on since doing a lot more reading. There was a lot of skepticism about the TPP floating around the internet back in the day, regarding how it was negotiated in secret, how it gave too much power to corporations, that sort of thing. I recall seeing conspiratorial posts on Twitter about how the TPP was going to set up international courts that superseded the sovereignty of all signatory nations, though those tweets have since been lost to time. But the ultimate goal of the TPP was to reduce Chinese influence by lowering trade restrictions between America and a bunch of other countries, a goal which went unfulfilled when Trump pulled America out of the deal in 2017.
I'm going to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has not yet been ratified. So, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is another disaster, done and pushed by special interests who want to rape our country.
However, the TPP still exists. The other countries simply signed it without the Americans, and they rerouted their economies around American involvement. Though I still have some criticisms of the TPP, I overall think it's good, and so Trudeau's part in renegotiating it was also good. However, I have many more complaints about Trudeau's tenure than I do praises, which sucks because I'm a Liberal, and he was the leader of the Liberal Party for a decade, during which he tilted it towards progressivism. The list of criticisms that I have of the Trudeau years is extensive, so let's get started. The big one that everyone who's Canadian remembers right off the bat is electoral reform. One of Trudeau's big promises in 2015 was to reform Canada's first-past-the-post voting system and use something like ranked voting instead. I recall everyone being excited by this. The House of Commons put together a committee to explore the idea, and ultimately, nothing happened. Trudeau claimed that none of the other voting alternatives that were explored were popular enough.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has abandoned his commitment. He has betrayed Canadians. A political party promises something in order to get elected and to appear progressive, but then once elected, they shamelessly break that promise. I would call that a massive political deception. What does the Prime Minister call it?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, over the past year, we consulted with hundreds of thousands of Canadians to hear their views on transforming our electoral system. It's very clear, as people in this House know, I have long preferred a preferential ballot. The members opposite wanted a proportional representation. The official opposition wanted a referendum. There is no consensus. There is no clear path forward. It would be irresponsible for us to do something that harms Canada's stability when, in fact, what we need is moving forward on growth for the middle class and support.
Honourable Member for Outremont.
The Prime Minister obviously never read the report, Mr. Speaker. The My Democracy charade didn't even ask Canadians if they wanted to change the voting system. But you know what? At almost every single one of the Prime Minister's town halls, someone asked him about democratic reform. So as the Prime Minister now fabricates evidence to claim Canadians didn't want what he got elected on, my question is, what expression from Canadians would have been sufficient to get the Prime Minister to respect his own promise?
Honourable Prime Minister.
It is very clear, Mr. Speaker, there is no consensus amongst Canadians on how or even whether to reform our electoral system and to change the mode of election. That's why we're going to focus on strengthening our resistance and resilience to cyber attacks from foreign interveners. Why we're going to be continuing to repeal the unfair provisions in the so-called Fair Elections Act, and why we're moving forward with greater transparency and accountability on the strong rules we already have on federal fundraising. We're moving forward in a way that will focus on the things that matter to Canadians. That is what Canadians elected us to do.
Honourable Député d'Outremont. Alors.
Cyber attacks? What about attacks on truth, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister made this promise hundreds of times during the election. He wrote it in his party's platform. He put it in his very first throne speech. You know what? They promised it 1,813 times since they got elected. That's the real number, Mr. Speaker. How can Canadians trust anything this Prime Minister has to say after he has so blatantly and intentionally betrayed his own word?
And additionally, that extremist elements of Canadian society would be augmented if the voting system were changed.
I always felt that we could make a clear improvement to our political process by offering people to not ever have to vote strategically again, to give a preference on your ballot, to rank your ballot. A lot of people don't like it. A lot of people say it favors Liberals. What it does is it favors parties who are good at reaching out to find common ground with broad groups of Canadians, to say, can I be your second choice? That's what it does. I think that's probably a good thing, but I have heard very clearly that people don't think that's a good thing. Or that they think it would favor Liberals too much, and therefore I'm not going near it, because I am not going to do something that everyone is convinced is going to favor one party over another. If we were to make a change or risk a change that would augment individual voices, that would augment extremist voices and activist voices that don't get to sit within a party that figures out what the best path for the whole future of the country, like the existing three big parties do. I think we be entering an era of instability and uncertainty.
The media at the time blasted him for turning on the promise, and the attitude that I remember personally was a lot of bitterness from the electorate towards him. But ultimately, nothing changed. Funnily enough, in Trudeau's resignation speech in 2025, he actually regretted dropping the issue.
I do wish that we'd been able to change the way we elect our governments in this country so that people could simply choose a second choice or a third choice on the same ballot, so that parties would spend more time trying to be people's second or third choices, and people would have been looking for things they have in common instead of trying to polarize and divide Canadians against each other. I think in this time, figuring out how to pull together and find common ground remains something that is really important for democracies.
On social issues, Trudeau is staunchly left-wing, earning that woke label that people often paint him with. He's loudly pro-choice, to the point that he made a big public display of ejecting non-pro-choice candidates from the Liberal Party, even though, unlike in the States, abortion is pretty much a settled topic in Canada. Most people here are pro-choice and nobody really cares. He's open about being a feminist as well. Yes, it's 2015, I get it. He engaged in all of the appropriate virtue signals on the topic. Like, for example, when he was attending the 2018 World Economic Forum. You know, the spooky neo-lib shadow government that apparently controls the world. He devoted his speech not to discussing how the reptilian overlords were going to begin mind-controlling the Earth's population with Jewish 5G satellites or something, but rather the Me Too movement.
Race, religion, sexuality, socioeconomic status, those are just a few of the ways that women are even further discriminated against. And finally, here's the really big one. Me Too. Time's up. The Women's March. These movements tell us that we need to have a critical discussion on women's rights, equality, and the power dynamics of gender.
Yeah, the ridiculous levels of soy wokeness that oozes out of Trudeau just makes people cringe. Like when he actually told a voter at a town hall saying mankind that they should say peoplekind instead.
Maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look into
we
that.
like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly. Yes, thank you.
We can all learn from each other.
When it comes to stuff like political correctness or nitpicky virtue signaling or whatever, it doesn't actually matter whether or not you're factually correct. It's always going to come off as annoying because nobody wants to be preached at. Basically, the vibe is off. More importantly, a lot of the really woke stuff that he does seems to be an overcorrection from his past, when, for example, he was younger and wore blackface multiple times. Or when it came out in 2018 that back in 2000, he came on to a reporter at an event, but from her point of view it was groping, not flirting. Of course, he refused to allow the event to be investigated, despite saying that his zero-tolerance policy applies to himself, a policy which saw multiple other MPs get drummed out of the party for similar accusations. But okay, it's just an accusation, and it is a really old one. It could be a bunch of bullshit after all. But then there was the time that Trudeau knew of credible allegations against the Chief of Defence Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces, and did nothing about it. Oh boy. It's really easy to craft a narrative of Trudeau as one of those progressive feminist allies, who believes that his correct politics gives him leeway to act inappropriately sometimes. It might even be true. It's not like those types are rare on the left or anything. Over his 10 years in office, his progressive credentials were repeatedly tarnished. And even if all the claims about him are just untrue, it certainly appeared to everyone on the outside that his progressive social stances were basically just a cover. But there is one event of this type that is absolutely true. And more importantly, it bridges the gap between culture war-esque hypocritical feminist stuff and stories about Trudeau's years in power that are actually far more serious. There's a scandal that's hung over Trudeau's head for basically his entire tenure, the SNC-Lavalin affair. I've spoken about it several times in this channel before, but here's the rundown. SNC-Lavalin was a Canadian construction company. It still exists, by the way, they've just changed their name. They're highly successful, working all over the world doing big-name projects. They've also repeatedly been an avenue for Liberal Party corruption in Canada, with Liberal candidates and MPs, and the party itself getting caught taking bribes from the company. And by the way, these aren't conspiracy theories. This isn't like a single text that says 10 held for the big guy, and then nothing else in the way of actual evidence, like with the Biden-Burisma shit. No, this time we've got lawsuits, we've got convictions, we've got plea deals. This actually happened. In 2019, the Canadian newspaper The Globe and Mail published a bombshell article making the details of the events public for the first time. SNC-Lavalin had been handling large construction projects in Libya under Gaddafi during the 2000s, and by 2009, solid evidence began to surface that the company paid Gaddafi and his family approximately $48 million in bribes over the course of years in exchange for preferential treatment in their country, as well as less solid evidence that the Liberal Party was using SNC-Lavalin for this purpose. There's a lot of ways the money was funneled over time, but probably the most sensationalistic story was when Gaddafi's son was visiting Canada in 2008, and SNC-Lavalin paid for his trip to a Canadian brothel, which of course the Conservatives spun as Liberal Party money and taxpayer money, funding Libyan brothel trips as soon as the story broke.
This is what SNC's intervention looked like. $30,000 worth of Canadian prostitutes given to Muammar Gaddafi's son. This is the so-called victimless crime that our woke, feminist prime minister is moving mountains to cover up. When did the prime minister learn that SNC-Lavalin paid for prostitutes for Muammar Gaddafi's son?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, every step of the way, we will stand up for Canadian workers. We will stand up for good jobs right across this country.
And you know what? Based on what's been made public, it's not exactly impossible. In 2015, the RCMP, that's Canada's federal level police force, kind of like the FBI, charged SNC-Lavalin with fraud and corruption, which the company pled not guilty to. This was a big deal, because under Canadian law, if convicted, the company would not be eligible for any public contracts for a decade. Once Trudeau came into office later that year, SNC-Lavalin began an aggressive lobbying campaign with his government to alter the criminal code in such a way that would allow them to avoid prosecution. The company advocated for what is known as a DPA, or a Deferred Prosecution Agreement. A DPA is usually used for fraud or corruption offenses and allows punishment to basically be voided in exchange for voluntary restitution, a pattern of recent good behavior, and submitting itself for external examination to prove that internal procedures have been put into place to prevent the corruption from happening again. The DPA didn't exist as an option when SNC-Lavalin was charged, nor did it exist when Justin Trudeau came into office. But in June of 2018, the Liberals passed a budget bill containing a piece of legislation that made the DPA into a thing. The main SNC-Lavalin court case had been drug out the entire time, though during that period, an SNC-Lavalin VP was charged with breaking electoral finance laws. The company requested a DPA for their case, but by October of 2018, the prosecutor's office declined, citing the nature and gravity of the charges, the degree of involvement of the senior officers of the business, and the fact that SNC-Lavalin knew about the crimes for years and didn't report them. SNC-Lavalin then brought the prosecutor's office to court, hoping to compel them to offer a DPA. In March of 2019, the court ruled against the company, making it clear that prosecutorial independence was paramount to a liberal democratic country separation of powers, which is in line with several previous Canadian Supreme Court rulings on the topic. However, when that February 2019 bombshell article dropped, blowing the story wide open, it was alleged that, in defiance of the principle that the government should not interfere with the work of the prosecutor's office for political purposes, the Prime Minister's office had been putting pressure on the Attorney General of Canada, Jody Wilson-Raybould, to offer SNC-Lavalin a DPA ever since October 2018. Jody Wilson-Raybould was a longtime ally and defender of Justin Trudeau, supporting and believing in his progressive vision for Canada. And of course, the fact that she was a high-profile Aboriginal woman in his cabinet also looked pretty good too. I can't overstate to you non-Canadians out there, this was a big deal. The fact that the article detailing everything dropped at the same time as Wilson-Raybould resigned, it was a monumental scandal for Trudeau's government. The SNC-Lavalin remains a huge mark on his feminist credentials, and a huge mark in his campaign claim that he represented a clean break from the old Liberal corruption of decades past, and frankly, a huge mark in his political legacy now that he's out of the leadership seat. The Justice Committee of the House of Commons held a series of hearings to hear testimony from those involved. Wilson-Raybould described to the committee under oath what happened between her and Trudeau with regards to the SNC-Lavalin case.
For a period of approximately 4 months between September and December of 2018, I experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in my role as the Attorney General of Canada in an inappropriate effort to secure a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin. These events involved 11 people, excluding myself and my political staff, from the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, and the office of the Minister of Finance. This included in-person conversations, telephone calls, emails, and text messages. There were approximately 10 phone calls and 10 meetings specifically about SNC, and I and/or my staff were a part of these meetings. Within these conversations, there were expressed statements regarding the necessity of interference in the SNC-Lavalin matter, the potential of consequences, and veiled threats if a DPA was not made available to SNC. It is well established that the Attorney General exercises prosecutorial discretion. She or he does so individually and independently. These are not Cabinet decisions. I will say that it is appropriate for Cabinet colleagues to draw to the Attorney General's attention what they see as important policy considerations that are relevant to decisions about how a prosecution will proceed. What is not appropriate is pressing the Attorney General on matters that she or he cannot take into account, such as partisan political considerations, continuing to urge the Attorney General to take her or his mind 4 months after the decision has been made, or suggesting that a collision with the Prime Minister on these matters should be avoided. Ben Chin, Minister Morneau's Chief of Staff, emailed my Chief of Staff and they arranged to talk. He wanted to talk about SNC and what we could do, if anything, to address this. He said to her, my chief, that if they don't get a DPA, they will leave Montreal, and it's the Quebec election right now, so we can't have that happen. He said that they have a big meeting coming up on Tuesday and that this bad news may go public. A follow-up conversation between Ben Chin and a member of my staff, François Giroux, occurred on September the 11th. Mr. Chin said that SNC had been informed that by the PPSC that it cannot enter into a DPA. And Ben again detailed the reasons why they were told that they were not getting a DPA. Mr. Chin also noted that SNC's legal counsel, Frank Iacobucci, and further detailed what the terms were that SNC was prepared to agree to, stating that they viewed this as part of a negotiation. My Chief of Staff had a phone call with Mathieu Bouchard and Elder Marquez from the Prime Minister's office. They wanted to discuss SNC. They told her that SNC had made further submissions to the Crown and that there is some softening, but not much. They said that they think we should be able to find a more reasonable resolution here. They told her that SNC's next board meeting is on Thursday, which was September the 20th. They also mentioned the Quebec election context. They asked my chief if someone has suggested the outside idea to the PPSC and asked whether or not we were open to this suggestion. They wanted to know if my deputy could do it. In response, my Chief of Staff stressed to them prosecutorial independence and potential concerns about the interference in the independence of the prosecutorial functions. Mr. Bouchard and Mr. Marquez kept telling her that they didn't want to cross any lines, but they asked my Chief of Staff to follow up with me directly on this matter. On September 17th, the Deputy Minister said that Finance had told her that they wanted to make sure that Kathleen understands the impact if we do nothing in this case. Given the potential concerns raised by this conversation, I discussed this later with my deputy. This same day, September 17th, I have my one-on-one meeting with the Prime Minister that I requested a couple of weeks ago. When I walked in, the Clerk of the Privy Council was in attendance as well. While the meeting was not about the issue of SNC and DPAs, the Prime Minister raised the issue immediately. The Prime Minister asked me to help out, to find a solution here for SNC, citing that if there is no DPA, there would be many jobs lost and that SNC would move from Montreal. In response, I explained to him the law and what I have the ability to do and not do under the Director of Public Prosecutions Act around issuing directives or assuming conduct of prosecutions. I told him that I had done my due diligence and had made up my mind on SNC and that I was not going to interfere with the decision of the Director. In response, the Prime Minister reiterated his concerns. I then explained how this came about and that I had received a Section 13 note from the DPP earlier in September and that I had considered the matter very closely. I further stated that I was very clear on my role as the Attorney General and that I am not prepared to issue a directive in this case, that it would not be appropriate. The Prime Minister again cited the potential loss of jobs and SNC moving. Then, to my surprise, the clerk started to make the case for the need for a DPA. He said, quote, "There is a board meeting on Thursday, September the 20th, with stockholders," end quote. Quote again, "They will likely be moving to London if this happens, and there is an election in Quebec soon," end quote. At that point, the Prime Minister jumped in, stressing that there is an election in Quebec and that, quote, "I am an MP in Quebec, the member for Papineau," end quote. I was quite taken aback. My response, and I vividly remember this as well, was to ask the Prime Minister a direct question while looking him in the eye. I asked, quote, "Are you politically interfering with my role, my decision as the Attorney General? I would strongly advise against it," end quote. The Prime Minister said, no, we just need to find a solution. The clerk then said that he spoke to my deputy and she said that I could speak to the director. I responded by saying no, I would not. That would be inappropriate. Later that day, my Chief of Staff had a phone call with Elder Marquez and Mathieu Bouchard from the Prime Minister's office. They wanted an update on what was going on regarding the DPAs since, quote, "we don't have a ton of time," end quote. She relayed my summary of the meeting with the clerk and the Prime Minister. Mathieu and Elder also raised the idea of a, quote, "informal reach out," end quote, to the DPP. My Chief of Staff said that she knew I was not comfortable with that, as it looked like and probably did constitute political interference. They asked whether that was true if it wasn't the Attorney General herself, but if it was her staff or the Deputy Minister. My Chief of Staff said yes, it would, and offered a call with me directly. They said that they will regroup and get back to you on that. Still on September the 19th, I spoke to Minister Morneau on this matter when we were in the House. He again stressed the need to save jobs, and I told him that engagements from his office to mine on SNC had to stop, that they were inappropriate. They did not stop. On September the 20th, my Chief of Staff had phone calls with Mr. Chin and Justin Toh, both members of the Minister of Finance's office, about DPAs and SNC. We did not hear from anyone again until October the 18th, when Mathieu Bouchard called my Chief of Staff and asked that I look at the option of seeking an external legal opinion on the DPP's decision not to extend an invitation to negotiate a DPA. This would become a recurring theme for some time in messages from the PMO, that an external review should be done of the DPP's decision. The next day as well, SNC filed a federal court application seeking to quash the DPP's decision to not enter into a remediation agreement with them. In my view, this necessarily put to rest any notion that I might speak to or intervene with the DPP or that external review could take place. The matter was now before the courts and a judge was being asked to look at the DPP's discretion. However, on October the 26th, 2018, when my Chief of Staff spoke to Mathieu Bouchard and communicated to him now that given that SNC has now filed in federal court seeking to review the DPP's decision, surely we had moved past the idea of the Attorney General intervening or getting an opinion on the same question. Mathieu replied that he was still interested in an external legal opinion idea. Could she not get an external legal opinion on whether the DPP had exercised their discretion properly? And then, on the application itself, the Attorney General could intervene, seek to stay the proceedings, given that she was awaiting a legal opinion. My Chief of Staff said that this would obviously be perceived as interference and her boss questioning the DPP's decision. Mathieu said that if 6 months from the election, SNC announces they're moving their headquarters out of Canada, that is bad. He said, quote, We can have the best policy in the world, but we need to get reelected, end quote. He said that everybody knows that this is the Attorney General's decision, but that he wants to make sure that all options are being canvassed. Mathieu said that if, at the end of the day, the Attorney General is not comfortable, that is fine. He just doesn't want any doors to be closed. Jessica, my chief of staff, said that I was always happy to speak to him should he wish. In mid-November, the PMO requested that I meet with Mathieu Bouchard and Elder Marquez to discuss the matter, which I did on November 22nd. I was irritated by having to have the meeting, as I had already told the Prime Minister, etc., that a DPA on SNC was not going to happen, that I was not going to issue a directive. Mathieu in this meeting did most of the talking. He was trying to tell me that there were options and that I needed to find a solution. I took them through the DPP Act, Section 15, Section 10, and talked about the prosecutorial independence as a constitutional principle, and that they were interfering. I talked about the Section 13 note, which they said they had never received, but I reminded them that we sent it to them in September. Mathieu and Elder continued to plead their case, talking about if I'm not sure in my decision that we could hire an eminent person to advise me. They were kicking the tires. I said no. My mind had been made up and they needed to stop. This was enough. On December the 5th of 2018, I met with Jerry Butts. We had both sought out this meeting. I wanted to speak about a number of things, including bringing up SNC and the barrage of people hounding me and my staff. Towards the end of our meeting, which was in the Chateau Laurier, I raised how I needed everybody to stop talking to me about SNC, as I had made up my mind and the engagements were inappropriate. Jerry then took over the conversation and said how we need a solution on the SNC stuff. He said I needed to find a solution. I said no, and I referenced the preliminary inquiry and the judicial review. Jerry talked to me about how the statute was a statute passed by Harper and that he does not like the law. I said something like, that is the law that we have. On December the 7th, I received a letter from the Prime Minister dated December 6th, attaching a letter from the CEO of SNC-Lavalin dated October the 15th. I responded to the Prime Minister's letter on December 6th, noting that the matter is before the court, so I cannot comment on it, and that the decision re a DPA was one for the DPP, which is independent of my office. This brings me to the final events in the chronology, the ones that signal, in my experience, the final escalation in efforts by the Prime Minister's office to interfere in this matter. On December 18th of 2018, my Chief of Staff was urgently summoned to a meeting with Jerry Butts and Katie Telford to discuss SNC. They wanted to know where I am at in terms of finding a solution. They told her that they felt like the issue was getting worse and that I was not doing anything. They referenced a possible call with the Prime Minister and the clerk the next day. I will now read to you a transcript of the most relevant sections of a text conversation between my Chief of Staff and I almost immediately after that meeting. Jessica. Basically, they want a solution, nothing new. They want external counsel retained to give you an opinion on whether you can review the DPP's decision here and whether you should in this case. I told them that would be interference. Jerry said, quote, Jess, there is no solution here that does not involve some interference, end quote. At least they are finally being honest about what they are asking you to do. Don't care about the PPSC's independence. Katie was like, quote, we don't want to debate legalities anymore, end quote. They keep being like, we aren't lawyers, but there has to be some solution here. She was like, quote, if Jody is nervous, we would of course line up all kinds of people to write op-eds saying that what she is doing is proper, end quote. On December the 19th, 2018, I was asked to have a call with the clerk. It was a fairly lengthy call, and I took the call from home and I was on my own, by myself. Given what occurred the previous day with my Chief of Staff, I was determined to end all interference and conversations about this matter once and for all. Here's part of what the clerk and I discussed. The clerk said he was calling about DPA's SNC. He said he wanted to pass on where the Prime Minister is at. He spoke about the company's board and the possibility of them selling out to someone else, moving their headquarters and job losses. He said that the Prime Minister wants to be able to say that he has tried everything he can within the legitimate toolbox. The clerk said that the Prime Minister is quite determined, quite firm, but he wants to know why the DPA route, which Parliament provided for, isn't being used. He said, quote, "I think he is going to find a way to get it done, one way or another." So he is in that kind of mood, and I wanted you to be aware of it, end quote. The clerk said he didn't know if the Prime Minister was planning on calling me directly or if he is thinking about getting somebody else to give him some advice. You know, he does not want to do anything outside of the box of what is legal or proper. He said that the Prime Minister wants to understand more, to give him advice on this or give you advice on this if you want to feel more comfortable you are not doing anything inappropriate or outside the frame. I told the clerk that I was 100% confident that I was doing nothing inappropriate. I again reiterated my confidence in where I am in my views on SNC and the DPA have not changed. I reiterate this is a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. I warned the clerk in this meeting that he was in this call that we were treading on dangerous ground here. I also issued a stern warning because as the Attorney General, I cannot act in a manner, and the prosecution cannot act in a manner that is not objective, that isn't independent. I cannot act in a partisan way, and I cannot be politically motivated. This all screams of that. The clerk wondered whether anyone could speak to the director about the context around this or get her to explain her reasonings. The clerk told me that he was going to have to report back to the Prime Minister before he leaves. He said again that the Prime Minister was in a pretty firm frame of mind about this, and that he was a bit worried. I asked what he's worried about. The clerk then made the comment about how it is not good for the Prime Minister and his Attorney General to be at loggerheads. I told the clerk that I was giving him my best advice and that if he did not accept that advice, then it is the Prime Minister's prerogative to do what he wants. But I am trying to protect the Prime Minister from political interference or perceived political interference or otherwise. The clerk acknowledged that, but said that the Prime Minister does not have the power to do what he wants. All the tools are in my hands, he said. On January the 7th, I received a call from the Prime Minister and was informed I was being shuffled out of my role as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. I will not go into details of this call or subsequent communications about the shuffle, but I will say that I stated I believe the reason was because of the SNC matter. They denied this to be the case. On January the 11th, 2019, the Friday before the shuffle, my former deputy minister is called by the clerk and told that the shuffle is happening and that she will be getting a new minister. As part of this conversation, the clerk tells the deputy that one of the first conversations that the new minister will be expected to have with the Prime Minister will be on SNC-Lavalin. In other words, that the new minister will need to be prepared to speak to the Prime Minister on this file. The deputy recounts this to my Chief of Staff, who tells me about the conversation. In my role as Attorney General, I had received the decision of the DPP in September, had reviewed the matter, made a decision on what was appropriate given a DPA, and communicated that to the Prime Minister. I had also taken additional steps that the Prime Minister asked me to, such as meeting with the clerk. In my view, the communications and efforts to change my mind on this matter should have stopped. Various officials also urged me to take partisan political considerations into account, which it was clearly improper for me to do so. We either have a system that is based on the rule of law, the independence of prosecutorial functions, and respect for those charged to use their discretion and powers in a particular way, or we do not. While in our system of government, policy-oriented discussion amongst people at early points in this conversation may be appropriate, the consistent and enduring efforts, even in the face of judicial proceedings on the same matter, and in the face of a clear decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General to continue and even intensify such efforts, raises serious red flags in my view.
Just to quickly sum it up, the Attorney General's office decided to not offer SNC-Lavalin a DPA. Wilson-Raybould was contacted by Liberal Party officials in Quebec, who said that SNC-Lavalin will leave if they don't get a deal, which means losing jobs. And the Liberals were currently running for office in Quebec, so they wanted her to change her mind. After she refused to budge, it went up the chain to Trudeau himself, who personally tried and failed to get her to change her mind. They badgered her repeatedly, admitting they didn't care they were violating the non-interference law. And eventually, because Trudeau just wanted the DPA deal done, he kicked her out of the Attorney General job and made her the Minister for Veterans Affairs instead. At this point, the story is no longer about SNC-Lavalin. Now it's about Trudeau improperly putting his thumb on the scale, interfering with the work of his own Attorney General, who by law and precedent is required to be impartial and insulated from political matters. By the way, Trudeau denied all of this, and Parliament's Justice Committee, being a body dominated by Liberal Party members, decided after the 4th day of hearings they were just going to stop the whole thing, and declined to interview other important individuals who had witnessed the interactions between Trudeau and Wilson-Raybould, like Trudeau's senior staff. They also declined to take further testimony from Wilson-Raybould herself, after other interviewees began to contradict her story, despite Conservative Party insistence that the committee should continue its work. One of those interviewees was Michael Wernick, the chief of the Privy Council. He gave testimony on the first day of the committee. Wilson-Raybould gave testimony on the second. He was called back in on the third day to basically just debunk her story. When it became obvious that the committee had no interest in bringing Wilson-Raybould back for further comment, she submitted to Parliament and released to the public a secret recording she had taken of a private conversation between herself and Wernick.
I'm not calling about the litigation directive. I'm calling about the other unpleasant one. The deferred prosecution agreement thing and SNC and so on. I wanted to pass on where the PM's at. Our intelligence from various sources is that the company is getting to a very serious point now. The board has asked consulting firms for options for the board for their next meeting, which could be selling out to somebody else, moving, various things.
Yeah.
So, and it seems to be real and not a bluff. So there's a lot of anxiety, like another rising anxiety, as you can imagine, about signature firm and job loss and all that coming after the Oshawa thing and what's going on in Calgary and whatnot. So the PM wants to be able to say that he has tried everything he can, within a legitimate toolbox to try to head that off. So he's quite determined, quite firm, that he wants to know why the DPA route, which Parliament provided for, isn't being used. And I think he's going to find a way to get it done one way or another. So he's in that kind of mood, and I wanted you to be aware of that.
Okay.
So I don't know if he's going to call you directly. He might. And he's willing, I think he's thinking about getting somebody else to give him some advice. He doesn't want to do anything that's outside the box of what's legal or proper. But his understanding is, the DPA tool is there. And you have options that we've talked about before to ask for reasoning from the DPP, or even to take over the prosecution of he just wants to understand more at this point why the DPA route isn't being taken up in this route. So he's thinking about bringing in somebody like Bev McLaughlin to give him advice on this, or to give you advice to make, if you want to feel more comfortable that you're not doing anything that's inappropriate or outside the frame of...
100% confident I'm doing nothing inappropriate.
Yeah. No, but would not be if you decided to use some of these tools under the law. Because I think he feels the government has to have done everything it can before we lose 9,000 jobs in a signature Canadian firm. I'm confident in where I'm at, and my views on SNC and the DPA haven't changed. This is a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence that, Michael, I have to say, including this conversation, previous conversations that I've had with the Prime Minister and many other people around it, it's entirely inappropriate, and it is political interference. And the Prime Minister obviously can talk to whomever he wants, but what I am trying to do is to protect him. I can have a conversation with Beverly McLaughlin. I can call her right now. I'm just issuing the strongest warning I can possibly issue that decisions that are made by the independent prosecutor are their decisions. We gave her and them the tools, the additional tools. I made it very clear at the cabinet table and in other places that these tools are the discretion of the prosecutor, and everybody agreed to that, and there was no guarantee that there would be a DPA in this or any other case. So we were treading on dangerous ground here, so I'm going to issue my stern warning because I can't act in a manner, and the prosecution can't act in a manner that is not objective, that isn't independent. I can't act in a partisan way, and it can't be politically motivated. All of this screams of that. So I'm actually uncomfortable having this conversation, but I'm happy to talk to you. The view that he's formed, which I think I share, I'm not the lawyer in any of these conversations, and Elder and others, is it's not interference. The statute specifically has these other provisions in it that allow you to ask questions of the DPP. That's provided for. It's not interference.
But I would have to issue a directive. I would have to gazette this. The prosecutor, the director, whom I know and understand after having several conversations with her about another directive on HIV that I issued, she is a by-the-book person. If this is gazetted, this will be, and this is not, and I hear you on the jobs and wanting to save jobs. I mean, we all want to do that. This goes far beyond saving jobs. This is about the integrity of the Prime Minister and interference. There's no way that anybody would interpret this other than interference if I was to step in. It doesn't matter how I would look in doing that. I mean, I'd be a mockery, and that's not the problem. The bigger problem is what it would look like down the road for the government. This is going to look like nothing but political interference by the Prime Minister, by you, by everybody else that's been involved in this, politically pressuring me to do this.
Well,
I feel like I actually really feel uncomfortable having this conversation because it's wrong. And I hear, and the Prime Minister obviously can call me. Like I said to you, I will have I'm going to call Beverly McLaughlin and have a conversation about her with her.
Okay, I understand that. But I think his view is he's not asking you to do anything appropriate or to interfere. He's asking you to use all of the tools that you lawfully have at your disposal.
I know I have a tool under the Prosecution Act that I can use. I do not believe it is appropriate to use it in this case.
Okay. All right. Then that's clear. He's in a very firm mood about this. So.
Does he understand the gravity of what this potentially could mean? This is not just about saving jobs. This is about interfering with one of our fundamental institutions. This is like breaching a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. So we can.
I don't think he sees it as that.
Well, then nobody's explaining that to him, Michael. The principle or the integrity of how we act and respond to the tools that we have available and what we should and shouldn't do. I don't know.
Okay. I respect where you're coming from. I just think.
You know what? I hope that you do, because I don't think anybody respects this. I mean, the conversation that Jerry and Katie had with my chief of staff, and I have it, like, she wrote down what they said, like saying that they don't want to have anything or hear any more about the legalities, but want to talk about jobs. Entirely inappropriate.
Okay, well, I mean, I wasn't.
Well, I have it. I have it all. It's just.
Okay, but I mean, you're not just the Attorney General, you're the Minister of Justice in the Cabinet, and, but you have context within which you exercise your roles and responsibilities. Like, I'm not seeing anything inappropriate here, but, all right, well, I don't, I'm going to have to report back on, I think, before he leaves. He's in a pretty firm frame of mind about this, though, so I'm a bit worried.
Bit worried about what?
Well, it's not a good idea for the Prime Minister and his Attorney General to be at loggerheads.
Well, I feel that I'm giving him my best advice, and if he doesn't accept that advice, then it's his prerogative to do what he wants. But I am trying to protect the Prime Minister from political interference, or perceived or otherwise.
I understand that, but he doesn't have the power to do what he wants. All the tools are in your hands, so.
Okay, so then, I'm having thoughts of the Saturday Night Massacre here, Michael, to be honest with you. And this is not a great place for me to be in. I don't relish being in this place, but what I am confident of is that I've given the Prime Minister my best advice to protect him and to protect the constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence.
Okay. All right, but I'm worried about a collision then, because he's pretty firm about this. I just saw him a few hours ago, and this is really important to him.
This call directly contradicts Wernick's previous testimony that neither he, Trudeau, or anybody else tried to pressure Wilson-Raybould. The Parliamentary Ethics Commissioner investigated the event, and by August of 2019 they released a report, concluding that Trudeau had violated Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act by improperly pressuring Wilson-Raybould. It also stated that the Privy Council refused to allow 9 key witnesses to testify, making available information about the case incomplete. The next legal step was for the Attorney General's office to file charges based on the law that was violated, which, to nobody's surprise, Wilson-Raybould's successor declined to do. He would also eventually grant SNC-Lavalin its DPA in 2022 after everybody had forgotten about the whole thing. In the aftermath of the SNC-Lavalin affair, multiple people close to Trudeau resigned, including several individuals involved in pressuring Wilson-Raybould directly. One person was Jane Philpott, the president of the Treasury Board, who wasn't involved in the event at all, but felt like she could no longer support Trudeau's government. In retaliation, Trudeau expelled both Wilson-Raybould and Philpott from the Liberal Party in April 2019, giving the excuse, "Our opponents win when Liberals are divided." In May of 2019, Wilson-Raybould declared her intention to run for re-election as an independent, a race that she won, which was largely taken as the electorate rejecting Trudeau's treatment of her. By September of 2019, the RCMP was conducting its own investigation into the affair, specifically the lack of legal action on the conflict of interest violation, which they considered to be a potential obstruction of justice charge. However, Trudeau's government was refusing to cooperate with the RCMP, blocking them from having access to relevant staffers or materials. Ultimately, the inquiry went nowhere, as the RCMP simply didn't have enough access to the relevant material. By the way, Americans, this is what, in my opinion, a corrupt legislative committee actually looks like, not the January 6th committee. This time around, the left-leaning party is actually admitting they're not getting testimonies from key people. They're ignoring calls to further investigate obvious leads, and they're doing everything they can to bury the story, despite the right-leaning party using every possible avenue available to oppose them. This is the weaponization of government, not the J6 committee. The SNC-Lavalin scandal is not the only time that Trudeau's been caught with his hand in the corruption cookie jar, by the way. But at the end of the day, he still wasn't being corrupt himself, he was just, defending his party's corruption. So let's talk about those moments where Trudeau may have actually been doing something corrupt himself. Let's begin with a shorter story. Bombardier is a Canadian aerospace manufacturer. They make planes and jets and spacecraft parts, though in the past they used to be one of the world's biggest producers of trains and boats and all sorts of vehicles, until falling on hard times in 2015. Trudeau's government provided a $372 million bailout to the floundering company, an action that massively blew up in Trudeau's face when $32 million of that money was spent on giving company executives bonuses, while at the same time they laid off an additional 14,000 workers.
Bombardier executives saw their compensation rise by nearly 50% last year. At the same time, the company was laying off thousands of its workers. Can you justify to taxpayers why the federal government lent Bombardier $372.5 million if the company has the money to pay their top executives so lavishly?
We know that like the auto sector, aerospace is one of the areas in which Canadians excel and will continue to rely on growth and good jobs for many years to come. We believe in the long-term profitability and growth within both our auto sector and our aerospace sector. That's why I was glad to be this morning in Windsor announcing that with a $100 million investment from the federal government into Ford, we're leveraging $1.2 billion worth of investments that Ford is making in its Canadian operations, which include research and development. We know that investing in Bombardier is a way of ensuring good long-term jobs in the aerospace industry right across the country, and that's exactly where we know we're going to be creating good jobs and opportunities for Canadians for years to come.
As a follow-up, why should taxpayers trust your government with their hard-earned money when you're lending it to a company that put millions in compensation for its executives ahead of preserving some Canadian jobs?
As people know, we respect the free market and the choices that companies will make, but we also have a responsibility to ensure that the investments we make with taxpayer dollars are leading to good jobs and growth that's going to have an impact on the middle class, on the communities they call home, and the long-term growth trajectory for our country. We know that investing in areas like the auto sector, as we did this morning, making a long-term loan to Bombardier for our aerospace industry, ensuring that we are creating opportunities not just for jobs now, but jobs for future generations through innovative, forward-thinking industries is exactly what Canadians are looking for in a government.
Additionally, one of the members of the board of directors simultaneously sat on the board of the Trudeau Foundation, a charitable organization set up in memory of Pierre Trudeau, and currently run by Alexander Trudeau, Justin's brother. After the bailout, the Conservative Party leader at the time wrote to both the Ethics Commissioner and the Lobbying Commissioner for Parliament to investigate if the Trudeau Foundation was being used to gain influence with the current government. Because although Trudeau himself divested from the organization upon taking office, both domestic and international donations skyrocketed, many from donors who were also lobbying the government at the same time. Now, nothing ever came of this, so we have no hard and fast evidence that this was corruption on Trudeau's part. So it's possible, but just unconfirmed. However, we will talk more about the Trudeau Foundation a little bit later. Here's another story that, to be honest, didn't really make waves in Canada, at least among the general population. I don't recall people really talking about this one the same way they did with SNC-Lavalin. But let's be completionists and go over it anyway. This is the Aga Khan affair. Prince Karim Al Husseini was, up until his death a couple of months ago, the 49th hereditary imam of the Nizari faith, which is the largest segment of Ismailism, which is the second largest branch of Shia Islam. The hereditary leader of this religious sect carries the inherited title of Aga Khan, which Al Husseini held for most of his life. Now, Al Husseini wasn't this weird cult leader or something. He was more cut from the cloth of an upper-class Middle Easterner who was raised in Western values and attended Western schools and spent most of his life in the West, even as his family and the corporations they owned held vast amounts of wealth and influence back in Iran. Pierre Trudeau was a good friend of Al Husseini, and as a child, Justin Trudeau accompanied his father on multiple trips where Al Husseini and his family were present. All of this sounds pretty normal so far. The upper class of various countries having meetings and doing business isn't exactly rare. But problems began to arise when, in 2017, the Parliamentary Ethics Commissioner found that Justin Trudeau had violated multiple provisions of the Conflict of Interest Act, where he and his family went on several vacations with Al Husseini to his private island in the Bahamas throughout 2016. This is important because in that same year, the Aga Khan Foundation received $50 million of federal funding from Trudeau's government. Trudeau did not disclose the trips. It had to once again be revealed by the Canadian media. In the Ethics Commissioner's report detailing the investigation, Al Husseini was found to have done nothing wrong. He was acting within his rights as a private citizen. But Trudeau, as an elected official, violated 4 sections of the Conflict of Interest Act. Failing to arrange his private affairs to avoid being in a conflict of interest, accepting a gift in exchange for influence, accepting travel on non-commercial private aircraft without declaration, and failing to recuse himself from any discussion, debate, decision, or vote in which he is in a conflict of interest. Trudeau publicly apologized for the scandal. However, Parliament once again refused to look into it further, voting on party lines against asking the Prime Minister to testify before a parliamentary committee. The RCMP considered filing charges against Trudeau, but ultimately dropped the case when they realized that the law as written allows for officials to accept gifts if they have the written consent from the head of their branch of government. And since Trudeau's the head, he can quite literally simply write a letter to himself saying that it's all good. Here's another example, this one's more high profile. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Trudeau's government began to put programs in place to help various segments of Canadian society during the lockdowns. A wide-reaching stimulus package which totaled $9 billion. One of the initiatives was basically a jobs program for high school and university students who couldn't find summer work due to the lockdowns. The program would pay them for doing charitable work related to pandemic relief. The Canadian charity, known as We Charity, received $44 million to distribute grants to program participants, and to connect applicants with jobs related to the program. Objections came in from the Conservatives, who once again believed that Trudeau had a conflict of interest involving We Charity. Trudeau publicly stated that of all the various private charities in Canada, We Charity was the only one large enough to be able to do the job the government was asking.
We've launched an extremely ambitious program to get young people serving in their communities, young people helping out during this time of COVID, where we recognize that the usual job opportunities, the usual volunteering opportunities are simply not there. We're going to create opportunities for tens of thousands of young people right across the country to work with organizations large and small, in communities large and small right across the country. In order to do that, we needed to have a partner to help establish the networks and to deliver that with all partners across the country. And as the public service dug into it, they came back with only one organization that was capable of networking and organizing and delivering this program on the scale that we needed it, and that was the We program. We work with them in order to do this. We're making sure that their costs are covered, but they are not making any profits on this. Our focus is on helping kids get those opportunities that they need. We is a great organization that has done that in many ways and many times over the past years, and we're pleased to be partnering with them.
This was hard to believe, considering the existence of YMCA Canada and United Way, two very large Canadian charitable organizations who both confirmed they had not been contacted with the opportunity. During another round of the Ethics Committee looking into the affair, it came out that the government never really considered any other charity except We Charity, that both Trudeau himself and his then Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, were in direct communications with We Charity's higher-ups before the program was even made public, and that Trudeau's brother, mother, and wife had all received payments from We Charity over the years for various speaking arrangements, none of which had been disclosed during the deliberation of who to bring on for the COVID relief program. Same with Morneau's family as well, though more damningly this time, one of his daughters was actually directly employed by the organization. The Ethics Committee concluded that Morneau's office was directly responsible for the government's choice to run with We Charity, and that both of them had violated conflict of interest laws for failing to disclose their connections during parliamentary debate on the bill. Unlike with the previous parliamentary committees looking into these various events, the Prime Minister could not squirm out of testifying this time, since now the Liberals only had a minority government, and did not have enough support in Parliament to prevent procedures from moving forward. And it went about as well as you can expect for Trudeau.
Yes or no question, Mr. Chair. Prime Minister, you twice were found guilty of breaking the Ethics Act. After those two convictions, did you decide to read the Act?
You got 14 seconds, Prime Minister.
Yes, I have read the Act a number of times.
Are you aware of Section 21?
Yes, since I've read the Act, I'm aware of Section 21.
What does it say?
I can pull it up for you, but if you have it in front of you, you can remind me.
Well, it says a public office holder, of which you are one, shall recuse himself or herself from any discussion, decision, debate, or vote in any matter in which, in respect of which he or she would be in a conflict of interest. Now, what you've admitted today is not just that you were in a conflict of interest, but that you consciously recognized in your May cabinet meeting that such a conflict might exist. That it didn't just slide by your desk, that you were consciously aware that there was an inappropriate link to your family that would put you in a conflict. Why did you, at that moment, not call the ethics commissioner and recuse yourself?
That is simply not true, Mr. Poilievre. The issue of advancing issues for one's own family. And by the way, the ethics commissioner is looking into this right now, and I fully trust his judgment on determining it. But at the same time, my concern around recusing myself was a question around perceptions, because I knew full well that this Canada Summer Students Grant Program was not going to directly benefit my mother or my brother.
Your 16 seconds are up. Your 16 seconds are up. I'm going to ask you again, because nobody believes you when you say you don't know how much money your family has got from the WE group. So you've had a month to look into that. You knew you were going to testify here. Again, how much money total have your brother, mother, and spouse received from this organization? How much?
That information has been publicly shared, but I will highlight.
Well, then tell me what it is.
My mother
How much?
has
just the dollar figure.
Throughout her life.
The dollar figure, Prime Minister.
Various ways, and is proud of the work that she's done, and I'm proud of her.
How
as well.
much? I'm looking for a dollar figure.
We can get that number for you if you like. It's been out in the media.
It's been in the media, but you don't know it?
I don't have it in front of me. And quite
you don't
frankly,
know how much your family has received from this organization, which you tried to give $500 million, really?
Can I answer, Mr. Poilievre?
I'm waiting. You haven't done an answer so far. Let's make this the first one.
My mother has worked as an advocate.
The dollar figure, Prime Minister.
Speaker for
How much?
many good organizations across the country.
Mr. Prime Minister, you are being asked a direct question at a parliamentary committee.
Support her because she does her own work, and I'm proud of the work that she does.
Point of order.
But I do not feel that it is my responsibility to peer into the work my mother is doing, because I have
point of order to suspend.
She's doing.
Yes, that guy grilling him is Pierre Poilievre, who would eventually go on to be the Conservative Party leader. In fact, it's this event that really cemented in the minds of Canadians the image of Trudeau as a slimy bureaucrat, continuing the tradition of Liberal Party corruption in Canada, and the image of Poilievre as this ruthless truth seeker, doggedly taking him to task over the whole thing. As the committee ramped up its investigation, and the scandal only continued to grow, Morneau resigned as finance minister. Over the summer of 2020, various files and memos and other personal correspondence began to paint the picture that the civil service had been strongly pressured by Trudeau's government to select We Charity for the job. Other files were severely redacted, making them basically unreadable. And further investigation actually showed that these redactions were not done in accordance with Canadian law on redacting sensitive information within government files. Meaning there was redacted information in the files that should not have been redacted, and the redaction was done by somebody who wasn't qualified to do it. However, before anything could be done about the redacted files, Justin Trudeau asked the Governor-General to prorogue Parliament. Now, before we go any further, I should probably explain what proroguing Parliament actually is, since again, I know a lot of you guys are Americans. In the parliamentary system, there's prorogation and then there's dissolution. When it's time for an election, Parliament is dissolved. All of the sitting members of Parliament are technically no longer MPs. All currently tabled pieces of legislation that are not passed are binned. All parliamentary committees are ended. On paper, the legislative branch of government basically vanishes, at least temporarily, and the executive branch under the Governor-General controls the country until the next election is complete and the next Parliament shows up for work. Prorogation is basically when Parliament takes a break. When Parliament is prorogued, tabled legislation is binned, committees are ended, but Parliament is not dissolved. MPs continue to hold on to their seats. Because no election is coming up, they're just on recess. This usually happens once a year, in order to clear out tabled bills that just aren't going anywhere, or to force Parliament to finish up any business that they've been putting off. And it allows the party in power to put together a new legislative agenda during the off-season, to present to Parliament when they reconvene. Usually, Parliament goes into recess from early December to late January, the holiday season. Though there have been many times in many parliamentary countries where Parliament is prorogued for some other reason. However, prorogation in Canada has repeatedly been used to shut down Parliament during scandals that the ruling party wants to see swept under the rug. In 2002, the Liberal PM Chrétien asked the Governor-General to prorogue Parliament in order to avoid tabling a report about his party's ongoing corruption. In 2008, the Conservative PM Harper asked the Governor-General to prorogue Parliament when his minority government was threatened with a no-confidence vote. Harper asked for a second prorogation in 2009 to close up Parliament during the Olympic Games in Vancouver, but most people believe it was actually to shut down the ongoing investigation into Canadian abuses of Afghani prisoners. Justin Trudeau made a big show on his campaign trail about sharing the popular Canadian sentiment that prorogation had become a tool that leaders use to avoid democratic scrutiny of their actions. He even attended an anti-prorogation rally in 2010.
I hope, Mr. Speaker, that a future Prime Minister and future Prime Ministers will answer questions from all members, not just party leaders. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that future Prime Ministers will not abuse omnibus bills, will not use prorogation to avoid difficult situations. That is why we made these promises to Canadians, and that is why we are going to deliver on those promises to improve the way that this House works and to always be open to the suggestions that other members will have.
But nonetheless, by the time the We Charity scandal was in full swing, Trudeau asked for and received a prorogation of Parliament as soon as the improperly redacted documents dropped. This ended the committee's investigations into the matter, and freed We Charity of all legal obligation to release their documents, which they promptly refused to do, calling independent requests for transparency politicking. Efforts to re-establish the committee after prorogation were repeatedly blocked by filibuster, and eventually a private organization called the Stillman Foundation, which shared multiple board members with We Charity, put out a private investigative report stating that nothing was wrong with how the government and We Charity acted, actually. Meanwhile, the Ethics Committee, which, unlike committees for specific events, always exists no matter what, found that Trudeau's conduct during the We Charity affair appeared to have a conflict of interest, but it wasn't enough to judge that he violated any laws, though Morneau had actually violated 3. However, when it was time for charges to be brought against Morneau, he was no longer in Canada. He had moved to America and was teaching at Yale and sitting on the board of the American energy company NovaSource. And since Trudeau's government did not ask for extradition, the story was quietly dropped. By the way, Americans, this is what hiding evidence actually looks like. It's not what the J6 committee did, handing over all the evidence to the National Archives. I know the rightoids swallowed it down uncritically when idiots on Twitter began to claim that the evidence was destroyed because it wasn't given to the next Congress. But that's because all congressional committees that end never give their evidence to the next Congress. It always goes to the National Archives, and any future Congress can simply request to see it from the archives. What happened here in Canada is that the Liberals actually prevented evidence from being seen in parliamentary committee. They ran out the clock so that there was no obligation to prevent any further evidence, and they used parliamentary procedure to shut down legitimate investigation. This is what actual corruption looks like. While Justin Trudeau may have marketed himself to Canadian voters as a clean break from the old corruption scandals of the Liberal Party, in actuality, he simply continued those practices, from defending previous scandals that were committed before his time to actually engaging in new corruption himself. None of this is on par with, for example, trying to steal an election, but in my opinion it's pretty clear that Trudeau has no problem using his position to the personal benefit of himself and those close to him, even if it means he violates parliamentary ethics and the law to do so. Let's return to the Trudeau Foundation again for one final story, this one probably the most relevant on the international stage. In 2015, a Chinese billionaire and Communist Party advisor attended a Liberal fundraising event and ultimately pledged over $1 million to the Trudeau Foundation and Pierre Trudeau's alma mater, the University of Montreal. He didn't donate to the Liberal Party directly, as far as I can tell, though this may have been due to laws requiring disclosure of foreign donations or restricting the donations that a political party can receive from foreign sources. Nobody blinked an eye at this at the time, because in 2015, China's attempts to subvert Canadian elections had not yet been made public. On the face of it, this event just sounds like evidence of possible bog-standard international corruption. The type of thing that the Liberals under Trudeau and before Trudeau, as well as many other political parties in many other countries across the world get up to. But one additional point of interest is that part of this donation was originally intended to build statues of Pierre Trudeau alongside Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist revolutionary leader responsible for the deaths of millions of people, until the plan received pushback by Canadians who don't want to see a Chinese dictator immortalized in our soil, actually. Pierre was known to be a young socialist revolutionary himself in his student days, and though he moved towards liberalism as he became older and more educated, he still famously maintained friendships with figures from either side of the Iron Curtain, most notably the Cuban communist dictator Fidel Castro. And yes, we all know about the rumor that Castro is actually Justin's father, not Pierre. It's a story that stayed alive primarily due to the uncanny resemblance between the two men, as well as the fact that the relationship between Pierre and his wife was noticeably strained, with her basically turning into a high-flying party girl post-divorce. But as funny as it would be for the story to be true, there's just no way the timeline works out. Pierre Trudeau's first trip to Cuba was in 1976, and that was the first diplomatic contact between Fidel Castro and any government leader of any Western nation since 1960, while Justin Trudeau was born in 1971. That picture that everyone floats around with Castro holding a baby while Pierre's wife looks on approvingly, well, that baby isn't Justin, that's his younger brother Michael. As funny as it is for right-wingers to claim that Justin Trudeau is following in the communist footsteps of his true father, it's just not reality. To get back to the point though, the Chinese donation scandal related to the Liberal Party was, in fact, one of several similar scandals, where either the Liberal Party or Justin Trudeau himself took money from wealthy Chinese individuals in exchange for a meet and greet or giving a speech or something. These practices are actually legal because they're appearance fees, which Trudeau, the private citizen, can charge if he wants. But it also points toward an unsavory foreign influence in Canadian politics that the Liberals are generally happy to just sweep under the rug, which is the next topic we should talk about. In 2013, the newly elected leader of the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau, said that he had a level of admiration for the Chinese dictatorship, since that amount of government control allowed them to reorient their economy without having to worry about democratic concerns.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about, of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted, that I find quite interesting.
Trudeau's rivals pounced on that, saying it proves he admires dictatorship.
His answer demonstrates again a long-standing position of our party that he is in over his head.
I found it a bit silly for Justin Trudeau to say that what he admired the most was a dictatorship, frankly. I've always been rather fond of democracies.
And it wasn't just politicians who condemned Trudeau's comments.
A Canadian politician said, I look for China. I'm admire of the basic dictatorship in China. That is not only shocking, that is a shame.
This is just one of a large and ever-growing collection of Trudeauisms, like his blackface photos, for example, that paint the picture of Trudeau as this sort of progressive, upper-class dilettante. Somebody who probably means well, but has absolutely no education or expertise or talent or knowledge or anything else that qualifies him to talk on these matters. And he's only really where he is because of his family name. These Trudeauisms are routinely trotted out by the Conservative Party every time an election nears, with the whole Trudeau admires a communist dictatorship one particularly getting a lot of screen time. Personally, I believe that the relationship between the Trudeau government and the various ethnic diasporas that live in Canada can be roughly summed up as naive rather than overtly corrupt. Like, I don't think that Trudeau was some sort of Chinese plant whose true allegiance is to the CCP, and he was placed in Canada to run it in accordance with Chinese interests. I just think he's kind of a himbo. When it comes to Canadian elections, it's been public since 2021 that China has used various intermediaries to donate money to the campaigns of candidates that they believed would be beneficial to Chinese interests, and they violated Canada's election laws in doing so. Justin Trudeau was briefed by Canadian intelligence on the details of these operations as early as 2019, and possibly even earlier, but he decided to keep the information private, as well as not opening any investigations on the events until late 2022, when they finally leaked. Despite this, Trudeau insisted that Chinese interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections were not actually substantial enough to have swung those contests. Without actually seeing the evidence, we can't know for sure. At the same time, China doesn't only prop up Canadian politicians it likes, it actively moves against Canadians that speak out against their actions. Canadian citizens with Chinese ancestry are regularly harassed by so-called overseas police stations. The Chinese state has this view that Chinese cultural standards and Chinese law apply to all ethnic Chinese people, regardless of where they're currently living or what citizenship they hold. And in the past 20 to 30 years, they've set up a series of offices in other countries, where agents of the Chinese state monitor the actions of Chinese people living in those countries. If they do something China doesn't like, for example, speaking out against the Chinese Communist Party, those agents will threaten them, they'll threaten their family living back in China, sometimes they'll even kidnap and repatriate them, though that seems to be pretty rare. And if you happen to be an elected official with Chinese heritage, don't think that'll protect you. Quite the opposite, actually, as China aggressively targets Canadian MPs with Chinese ancestry, who vote against the interests of the Chinese state in Canada's parliament, with campaigns of slander and large donations to any of his pro-China opponents. Trudeau's government is aware of all this, by the way. The Liberals have repeatedly refused to act on this because they don't want to harm Canada's official diplomatic relationship with China. For example, when the Canadian Parliament voted overwhelmingly to declare China's treatment of the Uyghurs as genocide, with even Liberal MPs voting for the measure, Trudeau and his cabinet didn't support it. What exactly Trudeau's government seems to want to safeguard, with them treating China so softly despite mounting evidence that they are a threat, is Canada's trade relationship with them, which is, in my opinion, also really stupid. Because even though it is quite nice to have cheap stuff from China in Canadian stores sometimes, I am not blind to the threat that they pose in domains like, say, technology or resource extraction, like when the Chinese telecom Huawei was bidding to set up Canada's nationwide 5G network, or when Trudeau was contemplating selling Canadian mines to Chinese companies. Oh, and if you think the Conservatives are free of Chinese influence? No, that same intelligence report also revealed that the Chinese also funneled money to the campaigns of Conservative MPs under the previous PM Harper and the current leader Poilievre.
He was asked to spy on the Dalai Lama and the PM Harper at the time and blew the whistle, and Harper did nothing. And then I also connect this with a couple of years later, because I believe that was in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. In 2014, PM Harper signed a 30-year trade deal with China, and many experts at the time had really grave concerns that they expressed about how this may affect our national security. So, Mr. Katsuya, would you say that PM Harper was soft on China?
It became soft. It started with smoking guns right when he was elected the first time, even quoting me occasionally in the House of Commons. But with time, agents of influence were capable to gain access to him and change the course of his decision-making.
However, at least the Conservatives do seem to recognize the growing Chinese influence as a real problem, unlike the Liberals who alternate between ignoring it, paying a little bit of lip service to it, and calling you a racist for acting like it's anything more than a minor issue. However, while Chinese immigration to Canada dominated the 2000s, Indian immigration to Canada dominated the 2010s, and with that came a new set of issues. A disproportionate number of Indians who move to Canada are from the Punjab region of India, which is home to the Sikh religion. There's actually a group of hardline Sikh fundamentalists in India who want to see Punjab break away and form a Sikh theocratic ethno-state called Khalistan, and a noticeable number of the Sikh immigrants to Canada have been Khalistani activists and terrorists. Probably the most notable instance of Khalistani terrorism was the 1985 Air India bombing, where Air India Flight 182 was traveling from Montreal, Canada to London, England to Delhi, India. Khalistani terrorists in Canada placed a bomb concealed in a checked bag on the plane, which was carrying mostly Hindu Indian nationals, or Canadians and Britons of Indian ancestry, though there were a minority of Sikhs on board as well. The bomb exploded off the coast of Ireland, killing all the passengers and crew. On the same day, the same Khalistani terrorist group planted bombs on other planes as well, though none of them caused as much damage as Air India 182. One bomb exploded in a luggage check system in the Tokyo airport, having traveled from Vancouver to Tokyo. It turns out the terrorists had intended for that bomb to blow up on the plane as well, but they failed to take into account the fact that Japan doesn't use daylight savings time, so they mistimed the bomb's timer. Overall, the Khalistani plane bombings were the most deadly aviation terrorist event until 9/11. Now, most Canadians don't know about this event, and most Canadians back then didn't really care. It's never really been registered as a Canadian historic event, despite Canada playing a major part in it, because the wider Canadian cultural consciousness tends to not view the actions of minority immigrant populations as truly being Canadian, for better or worse. And in fact, this complete lack of care from the non-Sikh majority in Canada is part of the reason why the RCMP's investigation into the 2 surviving men of the terrorist cell provided no credible evidence of their involvement, and led to them getting acquitted at trial, because frankly, wider Canada just didn't give a shit. Ever since this event in 1985, though, Canadian and Indian relationships have been steadily degrading, especially since Prime Minister Modi's Indian nationalism has shaped the face of modern Indian politics. Canada has regularly welcomed Sikhs who have been repressed by the Indian government, and while many of them truly are victims of state repression and do end up being friendly, upstanding Canadian citizens who are grateful to be living in a country where they can practice their religion in peace, some of them are actually very pro-Khalistan and anti-India, very pro-Sikh and anti-Hindu, and they've brought their foreign ethnic conflicts into a country that frankly doesn't really know all that much about them. Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, Canada's far-left party, is also a Sikh, and he has a history of Khalistani activism. He attended Khalistani extremist events before becoming party leader. He successfully petitioned the government to remove a mention of Khalistani terrorism in a report detailing various domestic terrorist concerns in Canada, and he actually presented a rather conspiratorial view of who truly committed the Air India attack.
I want to ask you finally about the fact that you have long identified throughout your career with the grievances of the Sikh community against the Indian government. And you supported, for example, labeling the 1984 terrible riots in Delhi as a genocide of the Sikhs. Some people go further than that, don't they? Do you think that some Canadian Sikhs go too far when they honor Talvinder Singh Parmar as a martyr of the Sikh nation, when they put up posters of him as a shaheed, a martyr, when he was the architect of the Air India bombing? Do you think that's appropriate?
Well, I think it's so important that we really clarify a misconception that exists. There has been a lot of work and seems to be creating a conflict that's between Hindus and Sikhs. And for me, that's something that really offended me. I grew up with a lot of close friends and dear family friends that were from the Hindu faith that told me stories of how they actually put themselves at risk to save their Sikh neighbors. And so for me, one of my goals was to erase this false narrative of a Hindu-Sikh conflict, and what I really believe in.
Forgive me, but you could do that right now by saying, no, it isn't appropriate to put up posters of Canada's worst ever mass murderer. as a
But
martyr.
let me make sure we...
Do you think that's appropriate?
Well, let me just clarify a point here. It's so important that we rid this notion that there's ever been a conflict between Hindus and Sikhs. It's never been the case. We've been living in existence as neighbors.
Third time of asking. It's not a hard question.
But let me just finish. I'm just finishing my sentence.
Third time of asking. Is it appropriate to put up
Sorry, I'm just going to finish my sentence. So the community has lived together, coexisted in peace and harmony, and we need to celebrate that. So naming something a genocide takes the blame off of a community and puts it on the government. That's the facts. It was a government that initiated this. There's been great reports that point that out. There's been a lot of investigations and commissions that really clarify that it was the government, not the people. And I think that we need to make sure that we never inappropriately accuse the people of doing something when it was not their fault. This is something that's always been a government initiative, not the people. And so that's what I really believed in, making sure it was named a genocide and not a riot.
What about putting up posters of Parmar, the architect of the Air India bombing, as a martyr? Is that appropriate, yes or no?
So it is so unacceptable that the violence that was committed, the heinous massacre that was committed, is something that Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus all denounce. The violence that was perpetrated against innocent Canadian lives is something we all denounce. I regularly denounce it on the anniversary. It's something that we all collectively are opposed to. There is no question about this, that innocent lives were killed, and it is completely unacceptable. It needs to be denounced as a terrorist act.
So you won't denounce those posters of Parmar?
I don't know who was responsible, but I think we need to find out who's truly responsible. We need to make sure that the investigation actually results in a conviction of someone who's actually responsible. And we need to, as a society, collectively, unequivocally denounce any time innocent lives are lost. That is something unacceptable. All Canadians stand together, united against any forms of violence, terror against Canadians, and in fact against anyone around the world.
Which is actually pretty common in Khalistani activist communities, to downplay their involvement or deny it outright. Jagmeet eventually had to walk these comments back because engaging in terror denialism was just a bit too much heat to bring down, it turns out.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh on a media blitz today after being criticized for being soft on Sikh extremists.
The inquiry resulted in identifying Talwinder Singh Parmar.
That's the first time Singh has so clearly come out against Talwinder Singh Parmar, identified in the 1985 Air India inquiry as the mastermind behind the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history.
Should you not condemn the glorification of Talwinder Parmar when he's the mastermind of the Air India bombing?
The inquiry identified specifically Talwinder Singh Parmar, and I accept the findings of the investigation of the inquiry. I accept them and I condemn all those responsible.
So you accept that Talwinder Parmar was the mastermind of Air India?
Yes, I accept the findings of the inquiry, and that's one of the findings.
And the question... The condemnation comes after two videos recently emerged, this one from 2016, showing Singh next to a youth leader who has discussed violence as a legitimate form of resistance for those advocating a separate Sikh state.
We all know what happened in 1984.
And this footage from a rally the year before, where Sikh separatists displayed an image of Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, killed in an Indian military raid at the holiest site for Sikhs in 1984. To some, a martyr. To others, a terrorist.
He was behind a number of targeted assassinations and kidnappings.
Politically tricky for a leader who doesn't want to alienate Sikhs, but also wants to run the country.
There's certainly a way that this kind of thing plays with the Canadian public, and that's not favorable towards him.
Singh has denounced terrorism, but won't say whether there should be an independent Sikh state.
It's up to the people who are touched by those circumstances to make the decision.
Clearly. A break from Canada's long-standing policy calling for a united India.
It's kind of gross that a person like Jagmeet is considered a progressive darling, streaming video games with AOC and Hassan Piker and ContraPoints and Lance, despite his history of terrorist apologia.
When we propose similar policies in the United States, people are saying this is impossible, this is Candyland, this is not, viable, and you can literally drive one day. You can drive, but there's so much scaremongering around socialism in the United States that, this is why we can't have nice things.
Totally. Because to be honest, most Canadians have never even heard of Khalistani terrorism, let alone Americans or anyone else. But I bet that if Jagmeet was a right-winger instead of a left-winger, this part of his political profile would not be swept under the rug. In June of 2023, the president of one of Canada's largest and most politically radical Sikh temples, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, was killed by anonymous masked gunmen. In 2007, he became a Canadian citizen after being expelled and stripped of citizenship by India. He was wanted by the Indian government for allegedly participating in multiple violent events and criminal conspiracies, and according to them, he was in the midst of planning a large terrorist attack in India. In September 2023, Canadian intelligence confirmed that India had assassinated the men on Canadian soil.
Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Canada is a rule of law country. The protection of our citizens and defense of our sovereignty are fundamental. Our top priorities have therefore been, one, that our law enforcement and security agencies ensure the continued safety of all Canadians, and two, that all steps be taken to hold perpetrators of this murder to account.
And by October of 2023, further investigation had discovered Indian government involvement in multiple home invasions, drive-by shootings, arsons, and 2 other killings of Sikhs in Canada, as well as intimidation and coercion of Indian nationals living in Canada, much like what China had done. However, unlike with China, Canada actually responded. The RCMP arrested multiple people involved with the events, many of which were Indian agents or diplomats, and the government expelled the Indian diplomatic delegation from Canada. In the present, 2025, Canada's relationship with India is at a historic low. India views Canada as harboring Khalistani separatists and terrorists who want to undermine Indian unity in the Indian state, while Canada views India as infringing on its sovereignty by carrying out assassinations on its sovereign territory and flagrantly violating Canadian law in other respects. I can see both points of view. On the one hand, Canada has largely remained ignorant, sometimes willfully so, about the immigrants it's been letting in, oftentimes because complaining about it is viewed as racism. And as a result, the friendly, welcoming, inclusive nature of Canada has led us to bringing in people who frankly do not share our values and shouldn't be here. On the other hand, Canada isn't some failed state with no functioning institutions and no rule of law. There is no reason the Indian diplomatic mission couldn't present its evidence to Canada and request extradition, and the fact that they resorted to extrajudicial killings that violate the sovereignty of another country is unacceptable. And then of course there is the Muslim question in Canada, which in the mind of your average Canadian occupies the same space as the Sikh question, as being some foreign culture and religion, mostly adhered to by brown-skinned immigrants on the periphery of Canadian society. However, Khalistani terrorists aside, Sikhs and Sikh values tend to overall be a lot more peaceful and less against liberal democratic values than Muslims and Islamic values are. That's not to say there aren't good Muslims out there, obviously, but Islamic fundamentalism is a huge problem across the entire world, while Sikh fundamentalism is decidedly less so.
وأشهد أن محمدًا عبد الله ورسوله رغب في الجهاد وحرض المؤمنين وجعل ذروة سنام الإسلام الجهاد في سبيل الله وأخبر أن الجنة تحت ظلال السيوف. Ahmed Yassin, rahmatullahi alayh, the chief of Hamas before, and same thing, Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi. They went through the same path, the path of al-Mujahideen and al-Salihin fi sabilillah. The war machine and the killing machine of the Zionists, la'natullahi alayhim, and the Nasara that's supporting them, la'natullahi alayhim. The Christian country and the atheist country that's supporting them, US, and everyone supporting them, la'natullahi alayhim. اللهم اشد وطأتك على عدوهم من اليهود والصهاينة الغاصبين والنصارى ومن ساعدهم وأيدهم وأمدهم اللهم وعليك بالمنافقين من هذه الأمة اللهم أحصهم عددا واقتلهم.
The October 7th terrorist attacks in Israel saw Muslim diasporas across the Western world demonstrate in support of the Palestinian cause. But in many locations in Canada and elsewhere, these demonstrations turned violent and took on a decidedly anti-Semitic flavor beyond simply being against the government of Israel.
Action on October 7th!
Jews in Canada have been the targets of violence and hate, with Trudeau's government basically doing nothing, because Jews and Muslims are both minority groups, and white Western progressivism is uniquely incapable of dealing with a situation where one minority begins to prey on another. In 2015, shortly after Justin Trudeau took office, he gave an interview with the New York Times. I'm going to read to you a couple of paragraphs from that article. Trudeau told me, countries with a strong national identity, linguistic, religious, or cultural, are finding it a challenge to effectively integrate people from different backgrounds. In France, there is still a typical citizen and an atypical citizen. Canada doesn't have that dynamic. Terrorist groups have specifically said they're targeting Canada and Canadians. And on the subject of national security, Trudeau's critics say he's a lightweight and a dangerous one. Trudeau's most radical argument is that Canada is becoming a new kind of state, defined not by its European history, but by the multiplicity of its identities from all over the world. His embrace of a pan-cultural heritage makes him an avatar of his father's vision. There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada, he claimed. There are shared values: openness, respect, compassion, willingness to work hard, to be there for each other, to search for equality and justice. Those qualities are what make us the first post-national state. 10 years on, it is in my opinion that this vision of Trudeau's of Canada as a post-national state has completely failed. In the absence of that core identity, that mainstream, there has been no set of values to unite the people living in Canada. As a result, what's filled the vacuum are old ethnic conflicts that immigrant populations have brought with them. Your average Anglo or Franco-Canadian has nothing to do with Islamic hatred of Jews, or Khalistani nationalism, or the Chinese desire to retain dominion over its expats. And yet, these conflicts now play out in Canada. Trudeau's belief that you can simply run a country without a unifying principle turned out to be as dangerous as it was predicted 10 years ago.
If that person, according to our laws, even at the age of, according to this Canadian law, if someone sleeps... Who cares about the Canadian law? Okay. Who cares about the Canadian law? Listen to me, Hashim. Who cares? Look, if you sleep around with a 9-year-old, you're called a pedophile according to our law.
It's against Christ. How are you going to preach Christ?
Listen, Hashim, if you sleep with a 9-year-old in this country, you're called a pedophile.
Okay, but you know what? A 9-year-old is considered an adult.
Hashim, right? You're going to slap someone because they differ from you. They think that's pedophilia. You don't think it's pedophilia. And you somehow thought it was right to slap a man in his face.
Yes.
Because he differs.
Yes.
In retrospect, Trudeau appears to be utterly naive about the nature of power, of politics, of the great game played between nations, and his progressive devotion to the ideals of inclusivity and diversity have been thoroughly abused by foreign bad actors. These problems are far more complex than what I've presented here. I've basically just given you the surface level analysis of them. They're each deserving of a full video, which I might do one day, though others on YouTube have done a good job as well. But the solutions to these problems are not found within progressivism. We need to start understanding that foreign cultures aren't just these unique, interesting products that are meant to be consumed by cultureless, blank slate Westerners who believe themselves to be above it all. We do in fact have our own value set, unique to us, some of which immigrants don't share. And we are responsible for actively pushing forward our values and ensuring that they are adhered to in our society. Personally, I don't want us to be so inclusive that Muslims are throwing gays off rooftops in Canadian cities, because that's just their culture, and who are we as white colonizers to object to them? Personally, I don't give a fuck about what's progressive or what's racist or historic injustices or anything like that. There are core fundamental Western values that we should insist on, that we should impose on immigrant communities that seek to violate them. And if at least we can't insist that they don't kill gays because we're too cucked and self-hating, then as a country, Canada's fucking cooked. But saying that is racist or whatever. Of course, immigration to Canada hasn't only brought with it concerns of integration or ethnic strife. In fact, since most immigrants are actually pretty chill, the street conflicts are the least of our worries. In the year 2000, the population of Canada was 30 million people. By 2025, it's now 41 million. The Canadian fertility rate is 1.33, obviously below replacement, and it has been since the 1970s, which is around when most other first world nations experienced the same decline. Approximately 1/4 of all people currently in Canada weren't born here. This is a far greater population of foreign-born residents per capita as compared to the US or the UK, where for both countries, 14% of their populations are foreign-born. Right-wingers believe that America and Britain are both having significant problems integrating their new arrivals into their societies. And if you believe that's true, then Canada must be having a significantly harder time doing the same, having proportionally absorbed way more people. There's an activist organization in Canada called the Century Initiative, which seeks to make Canada a country with 100 million citizens by the year 2100. Their preferred method of achieving this goal is not through promoting fertility among Canadians, but rather massively increasing the amount of immigration to Canada. A quick look at their board members shows that most people heading up the organization are themselves immigrants of high status, working as investment bankers and in government positions and at universities, that sort of thing. Both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party have ties to this organization. Now, it's pretty easy for people who are more conspiracy-minded to tie the Century Initiative into some shadier narratives about immigration, specifically that some shadowy group of capitalists or Jews or lizardmen or whoever seek to destroy white Christian countries with waves of brown immigrants. However, a more charitable view of the organization is that they simply understand economic reality. A country with more people will always have the advantage of a larger labor pool versus a country with less people. All of the economically developed and powerful countries have relatively large populations, and Canada is at risk of economic decline without any population growth. There is, of course, some truth to this. However, there are also a series of negative economic consequences that come with immigration, and Canada has been very bad at grappling with these. Of course, among progressives, if you notice the problems, you're a racist or a bigot or a Nazi for seeing what is plainly in front of you. But you know what? I'm not a progressive, so let's actually discuss the issue. This is a graph of Canada's yearly immigration numbers from 1950 to 2023. You can see that though there's always been fluctuations in how many immigrants are coming to Canada, it never really broke 200,000 a year for most of this time period. Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015, and a few years later began to take off. The COVID pandemic reversed this trend for 1 year in 2021, and then, as if the Liberal government were trying to make up for the lost year, they massively accelerated immigration to historic highs. Of course, since Justin Trudeau is a progressive, he offered the usual sloganeering to justify these actions. You know what I mean, Canada's an inclusive country, diversity is our strength, we won't bow down to the bigots who are keeping us in the past, that sort of thing. However, there are more motivations than just ideological ones. During the pre-2015 times, the story that most Canadians believed in about the sub-200,000 immigrants per year that we were taking was that they were people of high cultural capital. Cultural capital is a concept in sociology that basically means the education, the knowledge, the experiences that a person has that makes them more or less valuable in a market economy. This can range from formal education or training to cultural habits or practices that contribute to the development of work ethic or highly valuing school or family values or other pro-social behaviors, to social standing within their culture. There is more to it than that, obviously, but that's a good enough overview for this conversation. Neoconservatives often talk about the value of cultural capital in immigration. You know, the idea that Western countries should take in the best and brightest of the third world, so that their talents and skills can find the maximum amount of expression due to them living in a developed first world country.
You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever close the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost.
In the Canadian context, Canada's immigration standards have historically generally been more strict than America's. We've had our share of immigration from China and India and Nigeria and the Philippines, but pre-Trudeau we tended to choose people who arrived with either a lot of money or a lot of education. For example, I recall when I was at university, I distinctly remember attending a talk given by a Nigerian immigrant to Canada. He could speak like a dozen different languages, he had a few master's degrees, and he moved to Canada because he had an idea to start a business that he just couldn't do in Nigeria due to that country's economic and political situation. He explicitly said, "I am lucky to be so blessed that a country like Canada would take me, because you would never take the average Nigerian who is barely literate and living in a metal shed, nor should you be expected to." He was an example of an immigrant to Canada who had high cultural capital. Due to what was probably a convergence of genetic and cultural factors, he was intelligent enough to learn multiple languages and get into school, hardworking enough to obtain several master's degrees, creative enough to have an idea for his own business, and driven enough to actually put a plan into motion. The Canadian immigrant success story was that people like him from all over the world could come to Canada and find an environment that was conducive to their success, which likely didn't exist in their home country, and as a result, the quality of Canadian immigrants were quite high, ranging from doctors to lawyers to professors to businessmen, that sort of thing. Now, this story about the Canadian immigration system pre-Trudeau isn't quite the truth. The situation was more complicated, as everything is, but personally, I'm comfortable with calling it mostly true. However, under Trudeau, Canada's immigration situation changed. We were no longer being choosy about immigrants, only letting in people of high cultural capital. No, our standards became a lot less strict. Part of it was the fact that the Liberal Party was simply blinded by progressive ideology, as the former immigration minister under the previous government explained.
What I'm going to say is not colored by partisanship. And what I'm going to say, I think, is becoming pretty quickly a consensus, including from a lot of sort of centrist and even traditionally liberal-leaning academics. I think that the Trudeau government has catastrophically mismanaged the Canadian immigration system in just about every way conceivable. You know, I mentioned all those reforms the Harper government did. They opposed almost all of them. But even then, come to think of it, you know, when Michael Ignatieff was leader of the Liberal opposition back in the day, I was able to get really fundamental asylum system reforms through with conditional Liberal support, because at least he and others were more grown-ups, more realists about widespread abuse and the need for integrity in the system. All of that seemed to go out the window when the Trudeau government came to office. they seem to be blinded by a kind of, deeply naive approach, like this, repeating these slogans, diversity is our greatest strength. And when Trump came to office, basically inviting alleged asylum claimants from around the world to come to Canada, which led to a huge flood in claims, which led to huge backlogs, which means slower processing times, which means more people come to get into that queue. And they doubled the permanent residency numbers overnight, even though the system wasn't set up to handle that. And then they opened floodgates on both the foreign student program and the temporary foreign worker program. And so now, at the end of the day, you're looking at like 500,000 permanent resident landings a year, 1 to 1.3 million temporary residents entering the country every year, a growth in at least 3 million in our population in the past 3 years, in the midst of a pre-existing housing crisis and a public health crisis, which is because of the obvious scarcity of healthcare providers and so on. And they did this and they also did it even though the economic data is very clear. High levels of lower skilled immigrants in every developed country in post-war history is correlated to declining per capita GDP. And what have we seen as a consequence of the Trudeau policy? He was on American TV a couple of weeks ago saying, well, Canada's economy is growing. Yeah, in absolute terms, when you bring millions of new people into the country, there's going to be additional demand. But in relative terms, we are one of the only developed countries in the world whose economy is actually shrinking. For 6 straight years, our per person gross domestic product, that is, if you take the total economic output of the country divided by the population, we've been declining on that metric now for 6 years. We've now gone down to the same per capita GDP as Alabama in the United States. I think it's, the 47th poorest of the 50 United States. We have taken a housing crisis and massively worsened it. Last year, we built about 220,000 housing units in Canada, but added 1 to 1.3 million people to our population. We have foreign students living 25 to an apartment, sleeping in shifts. Our homeless shelters are overflowing. Food bank usage has tripled, quadrupled. We frequently have average wait times to access a physician in Canadian hospitals and emergency wards at 24 hours or longer. I would argue all of these things were predictable and to a great extent preventable if they had maintained a prudent immigration policy. And I think part of this was, they got so carried away with their own rhetoric and frankly their own politics on this. They imagined that if anybody objected to these unmanageably high, unprecedented numbers, not just unprecedented in Canada, but really unprecedented in modern history across the developed West, they imagined if anybody objected to it, they could just call them racist and shut it down. And I think in some ways they thought they were creating a political trap for their partisan adversaries. They've fallen into that trap. And by the way, it's immigrants, it's new Canadians who are, in my experience, and according to polling, the most likely to oppose these unsustainably high levels of both permanent and temporary residents, because it's newcomers who tend to be at the bottom of the job market, hardest to get jobs, the bottom of the housing market, hardest to find housing, the bottom of the healthcare market, they're newcomers, hardest to get a new family physician. So I just think, and by the way, they've blown out the integrity of the system. In 2013, after my asylum system reforms, we were down to about 10,000 new refugee claims a year. This year, we're on track. We have at 120,000 for the first 8 months of the year. So we're on track for 180,000 refugee claims, 18 times more, 1,800% increase in refugee claims alone. And let me just add this: if we end up with this huge population of foreign students, we have something like 3 million 3 to 4 million temporary residents in the country. That's foreign students, temporary foreign workers, people on asylum claims. As they fall out of status, as their visas expire, some of them will do the right thing and go home, but others, all of the pressures on them from their families abroad to stay here, and others are going to overstay. We see a growing trend of the foreign students and temporary foreign workers whose visas have expired shifting into the asylum system, because word has gone out in the kind of migration channels and the circuits. I mean, there are folks who are constantly communicating about how do you stay in Canada, how do you get a work permit, how do you extend your status, how do you get permanent residency. And the word on the street is that if you're a foreign student, you're a foreign worker, you've timed out on your visa, you just walk down to an immigration office and say, I am making a refugee application, an asylum application. That gets you an open work permit. It gets you a guaranteed healthcare, public healthcare coverage. It keeps you in the country for now, because of the backlog, probably 2 or 3 years before you get to an asylum hearing. And then you'll make an appeal in what's a broken system. You'll be like 4, 5, 6 years before you get, if you're not really a refugee, before you get a final notice to leave. And by then you've been here for so long, you'll make a Hail Mary application. It's called a humanitarian and compassionate application to stay permanently. And who knows, then you'll have maybe a decent chance of getting it. And by the way, the Liberals, as far as I can tell, they've also basically told the Immigration Refugee Board to completely loosen up the traditional criteria for assessing asylum claims. So we're now getting, like, amongst our top source countries are well-established democracies with independent judiciaries like India and Mexico. Those are not perfect countries. Tell me one that is. And they're running at a 50% approval rate on their asylum claims, which is like 4 times higher than it used to be. I'm sorry to ramble, but the point is, you put all of that together, you're going to have a huge and growing number of people who are here illegally, quotes, out of status, a huge and growing number of people here in the asylum system, making it dysfunctional. And then if President Trump wins the US election on a commitment for, quotes, massive deportations and basically shutting down de facto access to the American asylum system for millions of illegals in the US, I predict you're going to have a huge flood north of many of those folks trying their chances here. So I think we are on the cusp. Things are very bad now, but they could become unsustainably, like we could have a true crisis in terms of homelessness and pressure on our social systems just months away.
And yeah, he beat me to the second reason too. Canada's economy has been growing on paper due to 2 things. 1, massive amounts of government spending meant to stimulate the economy, which does work in the short term, but has catastrophic long-term consequences. And 2, plugging up the holes in the Canadian economy with even more immigration. As he said, when you dump a bunch more people into a country without consideration for how productive they are, that does mean that demand for products and services skyrocket. More demand means companies get more business, they make more money, they can expand and hire more workers. That's all true. It's just capitalism at work. However, the actual quality of those jobs, the quality of those newly created products and services, is lower than before because the cultural capital of the immigrants that have come in is also lower. An extra million mouths to feed might be a business opportunity in the short term, but if those mouths don't actually produce anything of value to society after being fed, then they're simply an economic drain. If you want to scream at me that I'm being heartless or racist, fine, whatever, but the data doesn't care. There is a real economic cost to how Trudeau's government has conducted itself over the past decade. The number of people coming into Canada is higher than our ability to build new housing or create new jobs. Meanwhile, the quality of the housing and the jobs that are being created is certainly lower than what Canadians have come to expect. Most Canadians don't want to live in a house that's been converted into 20 bedrooms, barely large enough to stuff a mattress into, but a lot of third worlders will take that deal. Most Canadians don't want to be working minimum wage service jobs after they've graduated. Most Canadians simply want the quality of life that their parents enjoyed. And though advancements in technology have made a lot of things better, some things have actually just gotten worse due to mismanagement of the economy. But again, you're a racist if you complain. I think a lot of the hatred towards the boomer generation, both in Canada and in other first world countries as well, is due to just how oblivious they are that they had it really good and that they actually benefit from the current situation even as the next generation suffers, with the property that they bought 50 years ago when it was dirt cheap now having this massively overinflated value. I know that it was simultaneously kind of scandalous, and not all that surprising really, when it came out that 40% of Trudeau's cabinet in 2023 were also real estate investors, who stood to personally profit if Canada's economy remained as broken as it is. Meanwhile, this clip went viral of the CEO of a Canadian rental company who was buying up single-family homes in both Canada and the States to divide into apartments and rent to young families. Basically believed that he was doing people a service by driving the price of housing up and then extracting rents from the people who would have bought that house for themselves had he and others like him not been around.
You are a multi-billion-dollar company. You're publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange.
Correct.
And the
Toronto Stock Exchange.
Toronto Stock Exchange. I even read in one of your own documents that your revenue went up last year by 67%. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're expanding. I mean, when you think about it, we have an incredible amount of demand for what we do. So, Leslie, in any given week, we might have 200 or 300 homes available.
For renting?
For renting. And we get about 10,000 leasing inquiries a week.
Tricon is trying to buy 800 houses a month.
I think if you asked a lot of millennials, and that tends to be our primary resident, they would probably tell you that they don't necessarily desire to own a home or to own a car. And they've grown up in the sharing economy, and for what's important to them is lifestyle, right? And so if they can move into this, what we call a turnkey or hotel-ready home, and have a low-maintenance lifestyle, that's very compelling for them.
Of course, housing is more complicated as well. If you own a house, you're responsible for fixing it. If you rent one, your landlord is obligated to fix it. And if they don't, you can bring them to the tenant board and get damages, at least here in Canada. If you own a house, you're paying taxes on that property. If you rent, that's the landlord's business. If you own and your house burns down, or it's destroyed by a flood or a hurricane or something, you're shit out of luck. You better hope your insurance pays out. But if you rent, you can simply move on to the next place. Renting means you don't own your own stuff, and that can be bad, but it also comes with the benefits of having a whole lot less risk and less responsibility. The situation in Canada isn't solely that greedy capitalists are empowered by government to keep home ownership out of the hands of honest, hardworking middle-class Canadians, but that is at least part of the situation. Anyway, even as immigration continued to cause obvious problems in Canada, Trudeau repeatedly doubled down on his government's plan to further accelerate immigration year over year, until finally even he had to admit the policy was a complete failure. Of course, he didn't blame himself or the Liberal Party, he blamed the bad actors who took advantage of the programs he put into place.
In the last 2 years, our population has grown really fast, like baby boom fast. And increasingly, bad actors like fake colleges and big chain corporations have been exploiting our immigration system for their own interests.
Now, if this sounds a lot like what Trudeau's critics were warning of back in that 2015 article, or what the previous immigration minister pointed out, that's because it basically was. It's wild to me that Trudeau's defense is that he was taken advantage of, when so many people saw this coming, and they were either ignored or shouted down as bigots. I'd like to point out that the Canadian policy on immigration is actually a lot closer to what could reasonably be called open borders than anything the United States has done. In America, you might have hyper-virtue signaling progressives and weirdo borders aren't real tranarchists, but those types really only exist on Twitter. The mainstream Democrat position isn't that borders are racist, or that there should be no immigration process whatsoever, and people should simply be able to come and go as they like. Illegal immigration did increase under Biden, but that upward trend had already begun under Trump in mid-2019, and it was happening independently of anything either administration had done. What drove this spike was the continuing collapse of Venezuela and Nicaragua. When COVID hit, both legal and illegal immigration, both into America and around the globe, pretty much stopped. And then, after the initial round of lockdowns were over, the previous trend resumed. There's a lot to criticize about the Biden administration's failure to take the southern border seriously for the first half of his tenure. Fair enough. But that is a far cry from actively desiring an open border policy. No mainstream Democrat politician has advocated for a policy of simply opening the floodgates and legalizing every person who walks in, without so much as a background check. But in Canada, Trudeau's immigration policy is actually a lot closer to what the American right-wingers think the American left is doing. Completely going slack on all restrictions, quality checking, safety checking, all of it out the window for ideological reasons, ignoring the economic fallout as things get worse for the Canadian working class, demanding this view of Canada as a post-national state, where ethnic concerns no longer exist, except in the minds of old-stock bigots who we all need to move past. The reason that Trudeau saw racists everywhere he looked is because he was including in that label normal, middle-class people who had reasonable concerns about the economic impact of his policies. And it was this tendency of him to look down his nose at those people who disagreed with his ideas that made him so deeply unpopular in the end. There's one housing story in Canada that serves as a great segue into our next topic. The Squamish Aboriginal tribe once had a village at the mouth of False Creek, a location that would one day be part of Vancouver. The village, called some native word that I can't pronounce, Senaqua, was designated as a First Nations reserve by the Canadian federal government in 1869. But the expansion of Vancouver by European colonists led to the 1913 illegal razing of the village, the seizure of the land, and the expulsion of the Squamish people living there. The federal government never authorized this action, and after decades of court proceedings, SNC-Lavalin was finally returned to the Squamish Tribal Authority in 2001. Progressives took this as a huge victory for Indigenous rights and the Land Back movement, which is a wider movement of ethnic solidarity between the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, America, Australia, and New Zealand, to see the descendants of the original inhabitants of these places to regain control over their ancestral territory. However, that applause turned to anger and confusion when, in 2019, the Squamish announced they had partnered with a real estate developer to turn the land they had reclaimed into a series of high-rise apartment buildings. Because this is tribal land and not Vancouver land, they're not bound by Vancouver regulations like height restrictions or zoning laws, and the Squamish fully intend to maximize this prime piece of real estate, right across the bridge from downtown Vancouver. I've always found the reaction to the SNC-Lavalin development project to be fascinatingly absurd. NIMBY boomer types who don't like it when the price of their house drops were outraged at a new supply of apartments going up in one of the most expensive living locations in the world. This is again basic economics. If demand is the same and supply increases, prices go down. Houses in Vancouver are quite valuable because lots of people want to live there, and there's not that much in the way of available units. But as soon as these apartments open up, that's a whole bunch more supply, which means more competition, which means the value of housing goes down. Meanwhile, the white progressive land back supporters were outraged because, despite their movements claiming to operate in support of Indigenous people, they often carry with them these racist views of how Native people in Canada actually live. They seem to have this expectation that the SNC-Lavalin site would be left to revert to nature and the Squamish people would return to using it as seasonal hunting grounds, like they used to hundreds of years ago, as if they were this relic of the past living a Stone Age existence, and not actually, people in a modern developed country with indoor plumbing and electricity and TVs and shit. Personally, I just think they see a gap in the market and want to make money. But this brings us to the Indigenous situation in Canada, which to be honest is quite similar to the situation in America. Both countries have a similar relationship with their native or Aboriginal or Indian populations, whatever you want to call them. Before Europeans showed up to the New World, the native tribes didn't live in peaceful harmony, despite what some fringe activists might say. They warred with each other. They raped and pillaged and enslaved each other, over land, over resources, over religion, though it's not like they had an organized faith structure in the Eurasian sense. Their civilization was basically a Stone Age level of technology, at least in Canada. I know the Inca and Maya empires are more technologically advanced, at least enough to have agriculture and cities and caste systems and at least some basic knowledge of metalworking. But the people indigenous to Canada and the Northern American states never really advanced up the tech tree beyond stone tools. So when Europeans showed up with ships and swords and currency and literacy, all of their physical and cultural technology basically made the interaction between the two groups completely lopsided. Whenever conflict broke out between the two, as it did regularly, the Europeans almost always completely rolled over them with practically no effort, and a lot of Aboriginal lives were lost during the colonization and pacification of the Americas. It wasn't all warfare though. In fact, the majority of the deaths probably came from old world diseases that Aboriginal people just had no natural immunity to. So, while America was manifest destinying across the lower half of the continent, Canada did pretty much the same with the upper half, and history played out the same way in both countries with regards to the now diminished Aboriginal population. You had treaties that were signed under duress and later violated, forced expulsions from ancestral lands, heavily restricted travel to basically just Indian reserves, which were in actuality the shittier parcels of land that Europeans didn't mind parting with. This is one of the darker moments of history for both America and Canada. A system of boarding schools was also set up in both countries, where Aboriginal children would be forcibly removed from their parents by the state and sent off to be educated. They would be taught not only the normal math and science and language courses of the time, but they'd also be educated in the Christian religion, and in Anglo culture more broadly. These schools were jointly established and ran by the government in partnership with various Christian churches, and at the time they were viewed as an essential part of civilizing the savage by disconnecting Aboriginal children from their family, culture, and religion, and raising them to be European instead, in an attempt to forcibly assimilate them into the new society that was being built around them. It should come to no surprise to anyone that the children who went through this educational program came out of it completely traumatized, and further investigation revealed that the majority of them suffered from physical or sexual abuse, malnutrition, and disease during their time in the system. Some activists claim that upwards of 30,000 Aboriginal children in Canada died due to what we call here the residential school system, but most other estimates reliably place that number around 3,000. In Canada, the schools were made compulsory to attend in 1894, and the final residential school didn't close its doors until as late as 1997, though by then the abuses had largely been curbed. The downstream effect of Canada's treatment of its Aboriginal population has basically created an underclass of people who seem to perpetually suffer from intergenerational trauma and substance abuse, and who are nonetheless highly skeptical of government, or more broadly white people in general, and their attempts to help them combat this problem. And considering what happened last time they received that help, fair enough. Thousands of individuals who suffered under the residential school system in Canada brought multiple huge class action lawsuits, and there's a whole bunch of legal proceedings and complexities that unfolded throughout the 90s and 2000s. We can just jump to the end. The Canadian government ultimately settled on a substantial $2 billion reparations package for the approximately 86,000 victims of the residential school system. As a part of this deal, the government became legally obligated to form a parliamentary committee tasked with and empowered to unearth the truth with regards to what really happened within the residential school system and colonial Canada's dealings with the Indigenous people more broadly, to make that evidence public, to admit wrongdoing, and to apologize.
In the 1870s, the federal government, partly in order to meet its obligations to educate Aboriginal children, began to play a role in the development and administration of these schools. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
Parliament began its work in 2008 and finished up in 2015. Throughout this time, the committee collected and preserved all available residential school records. It took sworn testimony from both former students and former employees of the schools. And it also investigated many non-residential school-related topics, like alcoholism among the Aboriginal population, or the tendency for Aboriginal women's disappearances to go uninvestigated in Canada's western provinces, that sort of thing. In 2015, several months before Justin Trudeau took office, the committee completed its work and released 94 recommendations for the government. And when Trudeau came to power, one of his first declarations was to promise to implement all of them.
En partenariat avec les communautés autochtones, les provinces, les territoires et d'autres partenaires importants, nous mettrons intégralement en œuvre les actions recommandées de la Commission de vérité et de réconciliation. Nous commencerons par donner suite à la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur le droit des peuples autochtones.
Now, if this were actually a real policy goal of Trudeau's, and not just virtue signaling, then he utterly failed at it, because nowadays, in 2025, like a dozen of them have been completed. However, if there is one way that Trudeau has had a lasting impact on the day-to-day lives of your average Canadian, it is on this issue. Curriculums detailing the true history of the abuse are now commonplace in Canadian high schools. There are new national holidays commemorating the abuse that are observed. And probably most noticeably, land acknowledgements are now normal in Canada.
Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theatre stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Sorry, hello? Sorry, excuse me, should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh, no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we do something about that, or?
Hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
Oh, okay, so some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
Oh, a portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water, or?
Oh, no, that money goes to Nestle.
Nestle.
They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry, I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
Yeah, I personally find these to be cringe and annoying. It doesn't matter to me who used to live on any given piece of land that an event is happening on, hundreds of years ago. And having heard so many of them in common everyday life at this point, they simply come off as self-flagellation that's been made so routine it no longer has any impact. It's become one of those things that you just sorta have to say, because if you don't, somebody will get angry, not because anybody actually cares. While the land acknowledgement stuff might be uniquely Canadian, we've also experienced our share of political activism that Americans are more familiar with. Statues of John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, are regularly vandalized or torn down by left-wing activists here in Canada, because he represents an old white slaver colonizer class that we should be ashamed of, the same way that similar activists tear down statues of Washington or Jefferson in the United States. And while this anti-Canada stuff has certainly existed for a while, for example, I did an old video on how these people wanted Canada to cease to exist as a state back on its 150th birthday in 2017, a new discovery completely changed the conversation. In July of 2021, an anthropologist was examining the Kamloops residential school grounds using ground-penetrating radar technology and observed roughly 200 disruptions in the ground, which she believed could be unmarked graves. Some Indigenous communities in the area believed the school held a mass gravesite, and some attendees of the school claimed that they had heard of other students who were forced to dig graves in the school's apple orchard. This went viral in Canadian spaces online, and for a time it actually spilled out into the non-Canadian internet, which is pretty rare for a domestic Canadian story, with one other big exception. And you know what? I believed it too at the time. It's not hard to see why. The residential school system was real. The abuses suffered by children in that system weren't simply made up. There's ample evidence of it happening, and we have discovered other graves on or near residential schools in the past, both marked and unmarked. For example, in 2004, near the former property of the Blue Quills Residential School, the partial remains of Aboriginal children were discovered, consisting of multiple skeletons wrapped in cloth. The method of burial used is in line with the disposal of corpses of people who had suffered from typhoid at the time, and there is some other evidence of a typhoid outbreak at the school during the same time period. Other schools had graveyards with marked graves attached to the grounds, and they weren't all just mass grave sites where bodies were dumped after a disease outbreak. Other locations were simply graveyards that had been abandoned and overgrown to the point that nobody recognized them anymore, but old records still confirmed their existence. The point I'm making is, despite the Kamloops mass grave site not appearing in any official records, the story wasn't inherently implausible. However, the Kamloops story turned out to not be true. I got it wrong, as did so many others. Lauren Southern didn't. In fact, she went on a Hippy Dippy stream to debate the issue against Lance from the Surfs, whom she absolutely fucking slaughtered. She was paired up with counterpoints, and Lance's partner was this rabbit dude, who got so utterly fucking destroyed, he ended up deleting his channel, at least for a little while anyway. Despite the very strong claims about the Kamloops story from the media, from activists, from Trudeau himself, no evidence was ever actually produced from subsequent investigations that the Kamloops residential school was the site of a mass grave. No human remains whatsoever have been discovered at the site. 1 year after the story broke, in May of 2022, the Canadian government had assembled a team of archaeologists to exhume whatever remains may be present. But by May of 2024, the local Indigenous government stated that the process was still ongoing, but all results were being kept confidential until completion. Now, just between me and you, it doesn't take you 3 years to dig a hole and see if a body is in there. And it's pretty likely at this point that the ground-penetrating sonar was detecting something other than human remains. And in fact, it later came out that the technology can be used to semi-reliably tell you that something's underground, but it's nearly impossible to tell what's actually down there using the scans alone. After the Kamloops story broke, the technology was used at other locations as well to discover even more apparent mass graves. And after archaeologists dug those up too, they found pretty much nothing. The only sites that were confirmed to actually contain bodies were ones that were already known to the parliamentary committee, meaning there was no hidden cache of corpses or whatever that was covered up by the authorities. In response to the initial announcement, though, the summer of 2021 saw a series of church arsons all across Canada, since as you'll recall, the church helped administrate the residential school system, and activists viewed random Christian churches as appropriate targets of retaliation. The number of burned churches claimed by the extremists on the other side range between 80 and 100, but actual investigations into these events have confirmed 24 arsons and a handful of other possible arsons, with at least 2 of them being unrelated to the residential school story. But nonetheless, it's still pretty clear what's going on here, especially since the arson spree kicked off with the burning of 4 Catholic churches, all on land controlled by Indigenous governments, all around the same time. Ultimately, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox churches were all targeted, and the perpetrators that had been caught were all very different from each other, all coming from different ethnicities and having very different backgrounds, almost none of them outright saying, "This is for Kamloops," but a good chunk of them had been vocal supporters for the land back movement, or they expressed support on social media, that sort of thing. This type of support was common in Canadian left-wing spaces, both online and offline. One security video was released of a church being burned in Vancouver, and it's actually the funniest thing. This overweight university student-looking chick waddles up, looks around, pours alcohol or something onto the glass door of the church, nonchalantly lights it up, and then waddles away like she's going to McDonald's or something. This casual attitude towards what could potentially be a murderous act, if somebody's inside and doesn't make it out, shows either extreme sociopathy or a level of naivete that you don't even see in toddlers. Many members of the Indigenous governments and communities actually just straightforwardly condemned the arson attacks, while it was Justin Trudeau himself who ended up lacking a spine on the issue. He agreed that church burnings were unacceptable, but he also said it was completely understandable for these people to be angry with the church, given its shameful history and its institutional racism.
One of my reflections is I understand the anger that's out there against the federal government, against institutions like the Catholic Church. It is real and it is fully understandable given the shameful history that we're all becoming more and more aware of and engaging ourselves to do better as Canadians. But I can't help but think that burning down churches is actually depriving people who are
in need of grieving and healing and mourning from places where they can actually grieve and reflect and look for support. We shouldn't be lashing out at buildings that can provide solace to some of our fellow citizens, but we should be every day committing ourselves, each and every one of us, to the hard work we need to do to actually rebuild a path forward that reflects the terrible intergenerational trauma and present-day realities of suffering that we are all collectively responsible for.
In the end, maybe a dozen people were arrested, one was convicted, and the entire series of events was quickly forgotten about as the summer of 2021 came to a close. But the initial Kamloops story was not forgotten about, despite ultimately being fake. Even though, once again, no evidence has been found, multiple Canadian organizations carried on referencing the apparent discoveries as if they were just true. Just making shit up has become completely normalized.
Canada's a little slow on the draw in terms of considering white hate groups as a domestic terror threat and the link to gun violence, because Indigenous peoples have been killed by white supremacists. Rural racism, not in the area of white hate group, but having the same feelings. I mean, what happened when unarmed Colton Bushy was shot point blank? What was the response by rural farmers? Let's get more weapons, let's shoot them, let's kill them and put them in the ground. And so it's that kind of incitement to violence that leads people to do things that they might not otherwise do if they didn't have that community of support.
One teacher was ultimately fired for saying that most children in the residential school system died of tuberculosis, which is actually backed up by the facts, and not of systemic torture and murder by the priests running the school, as one of his students claimed during class. The school received an anonymous complaint about inflammatory hate speech, and the teacher was sacked for refusing to recant. And in response to the continuing confirmations that the latest round of residential school stories are actually bullshit, both the federal and some of the provincial governments have repeatedly attempted to criminalize speech they call residential school denialism, which thankfully have not gone very far. It took a few years, but the story eventually made its way to the non-English speaking world. A Dutch newspaper ran an article on the series of events in February of 2024, and incredulously remarked that Canada descended into collective mass hysteria over its own sinful past before even stopping to confirm that the bodies actually existed. Which, yeah, is pretty much accurate. Unlike the actual residential school abuses, which have been reckoned with quite a bit by Canadian society, the hoax claims and the church burning stuff will probably never be reckoned with, and frankly they should be. There is a decidedly anti-Western, anti-First World, anti-Global North, if you want to use that phrase, streak within progressive activism. And in Canada, it manifests as anti-Canadaism. At the same time, significantly more Canadians per capita are progressives versus Americans, meaning that self-flagellation is actually pretty normalized around here, in comparison to the States, where some weirdo activists might want the white American majority to hate themselves, but most of the time the white American majority tells them to go sit on a cactus. But not here. Canadian society is actually, in part, that polite stereotype. Everyone believes that it is. And that comes with a lot of upsides. But a major downside is total, uncritical willingness to engage with, well, this nonsense. The topics we've discussed so far today, Liberal Party corruption, immigration, the economy, Indigenous issues, they're all core failures of Trudeau's government. And they've all deserved their devoted segment in this broader conversation about Canada's slow decline over the past decade. But if I'm being honest, this next set of issues, they're just kinda not nearly as important. They are things that Trudeau has failed to adequately tackle during his time in office, and every little bit adds up. But I don't think that these next ones are the core reasons his popularity has been in decline for the past few years. Nevertheless, let's talk a little bit about them anyway. First off, we've got gun rights in Canada. I want to begin by immediately admitting that I'm an outlier in my country. I personally actually really like the American Second Amendment, which is not a common view here at all. Most Canadians believe that the American affinity for gun ownership is part of why their culture is generally more violent than other first world countries, and why they have such a disproportionately high rate of gang violence and school shootings and that sort of thing. And while that's probably true, I still personally believe that Canada should have looser gun restrictions than it currently does. Because despite whatever social costs may come with the Second Amendment, the Americans are correct when they say that making guns illegal simply means that good, upstanding citizens are disarmed, while state actors and criminals get to keep their guns, though both for different reasons. This probably comes as no surprise, but conservatives tend to deregulate laws around guns, while liberals tend to treat guns the same way that a lot of European left-wing parties do. Unlike America, Canada has no romanticized view of guns as these tools of liberation to be used as a final measure against a tyrannical leader, though in practice all guns are inherently that. But Canada does have a highly developed hunting culture, probably even more so than America does, since Canada has 1/10 of America's population, while at the same time having significantly more empty land, leading to hunting being a pretty common pastime here. Meanwhile, the Canadian left is pretty direct in their long-term goal to one day abolish private gun ownership entirely, something that is always claimed with regards to the Democrats in the United States, with the whole Obama's coming for your guns thing, which almost never actually pans out. However, here it does. In April of 2020, a lone gunman committed the most deadly mass shooting in Canadian history, posing as an RCMP officer and killing 23 people during a traveling shootout towards the city of Halifax. I did a video detailing the event back when it happened if you want further details. What I didn't put in that video is that, once again, Parliament set up a committee to investigate, and when the committee's work finished in 2023, the final report basically blasted the RCMP for being grossly incompetent, as they made several major errors during the shooting spree. And of course, despite the investigation determining that all the guns used in the attack were illegally obtained, Trudeau used the event as a pretense to heavily crack down on legal gun ownership in Canada. By May 1st, just a few weeks after the event, he had reclassified 1,500 types of guns from restricted to prohibited under the Firearms Act, which the Prime Minister can advise the Governor-General to do unilaterally. The bans were questioned by legal experts, who pointed out that these changes would not have prevented the shooting at all. However, it also came out that the list of 1,500 guns that Trudeau banned, it seemed to be sourced from Google, as it was actually a list of the 1,500 most searched for products related to guns. Funnily enough, this list included non-gun products that a word filter just so happened to pick up, like Black Rifle Coffee. Yes, that means that for a while in Canada, it was illegal under the Firearms Act to own a bag of Black Rifle Coffee. Another minor topic in the bucket of minor topics we can spend a few minutes on is the Canadian healthcare system, specifically the voluntary euthanasia program. Once again, I've looked at this topic previously, but things have just gotten so much worse since then. This is also a topic that I've changed stances on over the years, as I've become more educated. If you asked me like a decade ago whether or not I supported legalizing voluntary euthanasia, I would have agreed with the idea. It seems like a free, liberal, consent-valuing society would want to give people who are extremely old or extremely sick, and they have nothing but pain and misery for their final few months of their life, the option to opt out early if that's what they prefer. That logic still makes sense to me, but the way it's rolled out in Canada has just been utterly horrendous. In early 2015, months before Trudeau took office, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that people who had grievous and irremediable medical conditions had the right to an assisted death. Before this, voluntary euthanasia in Canada existed under the same status as it did in a lot of other countries. Technically illegal, but still quietly done in moments of extreme need, where the law just doesn't get enforced when it's obvious that the person who just so happened to have too much morphine in their system was also 98 years old and suffering from chronic pain. In order to prevent a free-for-all, the court gave the government a 16-month stay on their decision, to give them time to pass legislation creating a framework for voluntary euthanasia. The court case in question, Carter v. Canada, is somewhat controversial because it turned out that the judge on that case was explicitly and intentionally not impartial. After retiring, she wrote in her memoir that her own experience of her terminally ill husband asking her to have their doctor turn the morphine up and allow him to die, and her rejection of his request, completely colored her judgment on the issue, and she saw the case as an opportunity to make up for it. By the way, Americans, this is what an activist judge actually looks like. The program the government created, Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAID, has basically been a complete shit show, one that the Liberal Party has repeatedly doubled down on. Most of the independent reports on the various checks and safeguards within the program have revealed that they just don't work whatsoever. For example, MAID is never supposed to be recommended to patients, only discussed if the patient asks first. But that boundary is regularly violated, with absurd stories constantly hitting mainstream media of veterans who request help getting prescribed MAID, or a wheelchair-bound individual who needs their chairlift in their house repaired getting offered MAID instead. The reason for this appears to be that the MAID program is actually really good at one thing: penny pinching. The program is routinely touted by both media and the government as a saving success story, driving down the cost of Canadian healthcare by just killing the patients. And don't forget the organs. You automatically consent to organ donation if you get MAID too. Each time the program was changed, it was made easier to obtain, with the latest change allowing for people with mental illnesses to get euthanized, which in my opinion is a far cry from the original grievous and irremediable standard. Considering that suicidality is a main symptom of mental illnesses like depression or psychosis or gender dysphoria, allowing these people to legally off themselves just because they want to is highly irresponsible. And if your argument is, well, they're suicidal, they'll just kill themselves anyway, and if they truly want to do it, you can't really stop them. Well, yeah, I understand that, but the data coming out of the MAID program shows that as MAID deaths go up, suicides are remaining relatively stable. What this means is that MAID isn't killing people who would have killed themselves in the absence of MAID. MAID is killing a whole new set of people who would otherwise still be alive. The next frontier in the fight to expand MAID to as many people as possible is to make it available to minors, though as Trudeau grows more unpopular, I think this particular initiative was quietly shelved. I can only laugh at this stuff because it's so absurdly stupid and evil. Whenever I look at right-wing dissident spaces, and they're talking about the evils of globalism and liberalism and communism, which aren't actually the same thing even though they think they are, one of the common criticisms they have of the broader left is that leftists tend to standardize and bureaucratize evil practices in an attempt to make them appear normal. The vital, fundamental humanity of each unique individual is turned into a number on a spreadsheet. People are considered fungible commodities that can be swapped around without any fuss. Countries are not the homelands of a population, they're an economic zone. You know these sort of arguments? The American Democrats don't quite fit the bill of this particular criticism of leftist bureaucratism. However, in Canada, the MAID program is actually a prime example of reducing people down into numbers, where the sick are regarded as an expense, and MAID is an inhuman solution that drives expenses as low as possible. The whole MAID thing, while completely morally reprehensible, in actuality really only affects an extreme minority of Canadians. Remember, Canada is a country of 41 million people, and a few thousand a year die of MAID. In my personal experience, it's not really a topic on the forefront of anyone's mind in real life, and it really only has such a high profile due to memes and internet culture, for better or worse. And our next mini topic is also cut from the same cloth, and that's Canada's approach to social media regulation. During the Trudeau years, the Liberal government has passed bill after bill after bill, restricting the free speech rights of Canadians. It's all been the usual anti-hate speech stuff that you've come to expect from European-style social democracies, which in my view makes it objectionable but not really unexpected. The Canadian free speech issue first came to prominence when Jordan Peterson started talking about being legally compelled to use a trans person's pronouns when referencing them in the third person, which is, once again, one of those issues where it's polite to do so, but it shouldn't be illegal not to do so.
You know, of course, that since this story broke, you've been called a lot of things.
Yeah.
One of which is a transphobe.
Yeah.
Some people have accused you of using the free speech issue to mask what's really going on here, which is an attempt to deprive other people of what they believe are their legitimate rights. Well, and I want to give you the opportunity to speak to whether or not you are a transphobe.
Well, I can tell you that I've received more letters from transsexual people supporting me than opposing me. And I never said anything really about transsexual people, about their existence, although that was the first thing that I was accused of doing. I didn't say that transsexual people didn't exist. I said that gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex do not vary independently, which they don't. And so this issue is in some sense only peripherally about transsexual issues. It's more centrally about gender issues. And then on top of that, and I think it's the biggest issue, is that it's a free speech issue.
It's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. And I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception.
Well, I don't understand what the claim that there's no such thing as biological sex means. And I certainly think it's, let's call it an error, to suggest that there's some sort of scientific consensus about that. I mean, there's biological differences between males and females in animals and human beings at every level of analysis.
Okay, I'm jumping in here, because what about the notion he put forward at the end there, that if you do not refer to people with the pronoun that they prefer to be referred to, that is a form, according to the Human Rights Commission, of discrimination.
It's not just a form of discrimination, it's a form of hate speech. That's why I made the video. I said that we were in danger of placing the refusal to use certain kinds of language into the same category as Holocaust denial, and suggested that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, especially since there's plenty of debate to be had about gender issues in our society, which I also think are also in danger of becoming illegal, and quite rapidly. So it isn't clear to me how long we'll be able to have the talk that we're having right now.
Could I speak to the campus climate about this? Because I don't agree with why Dr. Peterson has been asked to stop abusing students on campus.
To stop doing what?
Abusing students.
I see.
And other members of our learning community who do deserve respect and do deserve to be able to work and learn and contribute to society in a place where if they are physically assaulted, if they are
the assault so far came from the social justice warriors who are at this free speech rally, and almost 2 million people have watched those so far.
This is not accurate.
I've been thinking about this very carefully over the last 2 weeks. And it's partly because of the videos that I've made.
I thought you don't like cops, though.
But also because
you've accused him of abusing students by not using the pronouns they want to be addressed by.
That's how I see it, absolutely.
That is tantamount to abuse in your view?
Absolutely. Many, many global documents, many organizations.
How about violence? Is it tantamount to violence?
Yes,
How about
absolutely.
hate speech? Is it tantamount to hate speech?
Yes, of course. It's hate speech
Fine,
to tell someone that you won't refer to them as in a way that they that recognizes their humanity and dignity.
This is a minor issue in some ways compared to the larger issue that's at stake, which is they're our right to have discussions of this sort at all. Like, I mean, one thing that happened right when we started this was that there was an initial claim, for example, that there's no such thing as biological sex. Well, I believe quite firmly that if we continue on our present path at the universities for 5 more years, that's a discussion we will not actually be able to have on campuses.
Because it will be...
By fiat, I mean, the legislation already implicitly presumes that biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression, which we haven't even talked about yet, vary independently. That is simply not true.
It's when people sometimes become politicized, is when they realize that no matter what they do in the world, there will be people who will continue to attack them on racist grounds, on gender and sexual violence grounds, and that's why people start to fight back, and that's why people object.
And your attempts to regulate my language use, and
I don't care about your language use. I care about the safety of the people who are being harmed.
I know people who make your kinds of arguments are always concerned with other people's safety.
I'm concerned with my own safety. Just so that people are aware, my physical, emotional life and livelihood is at risk from being here.
I mean, I would hope that if I were a student of Dr. Peterson, that he would refer to me as she and wouldn't have a problem with that. But at the end of the day, you know, a personal pronoun preference still is a preference for what language other people use. And at the end of the day, I don't have ultimate control over what Dr. Peterson, what the language he chooses to use, or anybody else for that matters. That's up to them.
Okay, let me find out then.
The problem arises.
Let me find out. If she were a student of yours, what would you call her?
She.
You would. Okay.
And while some lefty naysayers occasionally say that nobody's been charged under the law, so why you worry about it, one man was, in fact, charged with hate speech under a provincial version of that law and required to pay $55,000 in restitution for distributing flyers that described the trans person running for office as a biological male who promoted homosexuality and transvestism. I don't agree with this guy's take, but I also don't think the government should be punishing people for hateful speech. However, the most internet-famous attempt from the Trudeau government to wrangle speech was their internet control bills. The obsession with hate speech capped out at the 2024 Online Harms Act, which actually included provisions in it that retroactively made old hate speech on the internet illegal, as well as hate speech you haven't spoken yet, but rather that somebody is afraid you might speak. I disagree with all of this stuff, and I think it's a massive government infringement on people's civil liberties. Individuals should have the right to be rude and distasteful and even hateful, even if I don't agree with them. But there's way more to this conversation beyond just hate speech. JJ McCullough did a series of excellent videos on this topic, covering the story in detail on his channel as it evolved over the years. He's the guy to go to for this one. But basically, the government of Canada wanted to regulate social media using a similar framework as the Broadcasting Act, which regulates radio and television, meaning that big tech would be obligated to promote Canadian content to Canadian users, and more importantly, provide money to help fund Canadian content. That was the Online Streaming Act, which the Liberals specifically limited debate on and pushed through. A similar bill, the Online News Act, laid out a similar framework to regulate social media platforms, but this time with regards to Canada's news regulations, rather than cultural production. Unsurprisingly, big tech, which isn't headquartered in Canada, told the Canadian government to pound sand. Social media sites simply began to block Canadian users from accessing all sorts of content. All in all, the internet regulation stuff coming out of Canada has been completely ineffectual and a total embarrassment for Trudeau's government. The last quickie I want to cover is climate change in Canada. And this is probably the single topic that Justin Trudeau's been the most overtly virtue signally over.
It's really, really easy when you're in a short-term survive. I got to be able to pay the rent this month. I got to be able to buy groceries for my kids, to say, okay, let's put climate change as a slightly lower priority. And that's something that's instinctive. When the storm comes, you want to hunker down and just sort of huddle up and wait for it to blow over. We can't do that around climate change. And unfortunately, we have an awful lot of political amplification of the kind of narrative that is directly opposed to that.
Like most of the progressives, Trudeau has paid a lot of lip service to climate change issues. And this is one of those topics where I broadly agree with him. I just think he's really cringe in how he goes about it. However, Canada's geography is actually relatively unique, in a way that makes transplanting over European-style leftism particularly dysfunctional when it comes to climate issues. Like I said earlier, Canada's got more landmass and 1/10 of the population as America does. However, we also have significant reserves of vital natural resources that America just doesn't have access to. Canada's potash reserves, used in fertilizer, is 4 times the amount of America's. We have 5 times the oil, 10 times the uranium. Canada is the 3rd largest producer of diamond in the world, while America has virtually no domestic supply. Though Canada and America have roughly the same amount of lumber, America needs its own supply, along with what Canada sells them, while Canadian lumber needs are much smaller. And while the planet heating up might be pretty bad for places near the equator, it's actually pretty good for Canada, at least to a point. Longer summers and shorter winters means a longer growing season. The permafrost line is receding northward, which means that more land can be used for farming or lumber. Northern resource extraction will be way less costly, and the Northwest Passage might actually be usable for shipping. If Canada was smart, we'd be investing in the north in preparation to become the next Panama, and we'd be building the infrastructure to get our vast quantity of natural resources to market. However, Canada under Trudeau has consistently failed to take advantage of these opportunities. Now, it's not fully for a lack of trying, mind you. Trudeau, to his credit, largely agrees with me here, and he's taken some flack from progressives for not permanently shutting down Canada's mining or oil operations, even though doing so would completely destroy our economy. But the causes that Trudeau gave lip service to, the environmental stuff, the land back stuff, that all came back to bite him in the ass during the 2020 pipeline protests. So, a natural gas pipeline was being built in British Columbia, and the plan was to build it through the traditional lands of the Wet'suwet'en people, another Indigenous tribe, and they've been protesting the project since 2010. The pipeline, as currently planned, doesn't actually go through their reservation, but it does go through land that the tribe views as ancestrally theirs. Eventually, in 2018, the legal dispute was finally settled in court, and the development company was given the go-ahead to start building. Activists in the area began to set up blockades of the various access roads that go through what they view as their territory, which are necessary to use to reach the construction site. The RCMP began to dismantle the barricades and arrest the activists, in accordance with the court order. And on January 1st, 2020, the tribal government demanded the eviction of the RCMP and TC Energy personnel. Pipeline construction was paused for the month, while the province attempted to negotiate with the chiefs. But by February 4th, negotiations had completely broken down. On February 6th, the RCMP moved into the area in full force. They destroyed all the blockades, they mass arrested everybody in the area, including journalists, and after this, the immediate will to continue with the obstruction seemed to vanish, and work on the pipeline continued. The provincial government declined to press criminal charges, and TC Energy declined to press civil charges. However, a series of solidarity protests broke out across Canada, while the activists continued their obstruction through legal means. Cycles of court cases and crackdowns continued until February of 2022, when masked assailants threatened pipeline workers and destroyed millions of dollars of equipment. Though these individuals managed to get away, it's at this point that both the company and the province began to press charges, and the activists finally started seeing some time inside a courtroom by late 2023. A lot of the various stories go cold at this point, but I did find the case of one trio of activists who were found guilty in 2024, but in 2025 they had their sentences reduced because recordings were discovered of the RCMP officers who arrested them acting racist towards them. The racism in question, by the way, was that the officers, while they were in private, laughed to each other about Aboriginal protest makeup and how it looked like the orcs from The Lord of the Rings. Well shit, guys, I guess extra credits was right. Anyway, the reason I'm going over this is because basically the entire drama played out under Trudeau's nose. He gave his token support for the cause of the landback people whenever he was asked publicly about the events, but he ultimately sided against them. However, more importantly are the solidarity protests that broke out across Canada during this period. Railways were blockaded, local transit lines were blockaded in Toronto, Hamilton, Montreal, bus lines were blocked. A cross-border line between Vancouver and Seattle was blocked. Every day the blockade continued, an estimated $425 million of economic activity was lost. But most importantly long-term is that the protracted use of blockades, along with the government's reluctance to actually clear them out within a timely manner, contributed massively to the normalization of the idea within the Canadian consciousness that forcing civil life to a standstill by gumming up the works with a mass of recalcitrant activists was now a form of acceptable political expression, a normalization which the government would heavily come to regret contributing to. The Canadian trucker protest that went down in early 2022 has probably become my community's largest meme. Like most people, Canadian and otherwise, I followed the trucker protest story as it unfolded, intending to eventually cover it on my channel. I have a tendency to not make a video on a topic until that topic is fully complete, even if that means being late to the game. For example, tons of people did early videos on Chugga Conroy's drama before he came out with receipts vindicating himself. And so they had to make follow-up videos where they pulled a complete 180 and pretended like they weren't part of the initial dogpile. But I waited until I felt like I could do a complete video, covering the entire story from start to finish. And I think what I eventually created was better for it. This is probably worse for my channel in terms of the algorithm and growth metrics. YouTube does like daily videos and hot takes. Tons of channels do nothing but the bare minimum. A 10-minute video where they slowly read an article and give you nothing more than their surface level take a couple times a day. And to their credit, they're far more successful than me. More subs, more views, certainly more money. But I've tried to do that sort of thing before, and frankly, it just feels like I'm wasting your time and mine. I want there to be some expectation that when you click on my video, you're getting something that is at least kinda interesting, something that's worth your view, not just some off-the-cuff take that has to be disavowed or reworded down the line. No, I've got Twitter for that. The downside to my approach is that sometimes in the pursuit of being a completionist, projects will snowball out of control, especially when there's always new things to add. That's happened to me a lot, and not just with the trucker video. It's kind of like perfectionism, but rather than making the perfect product, you're trying to make sure you have all possible info. I guess it is just completionism then. My initial reason for not making the trucker video was because I wanted to wait until the entire story was over. When the protest ended, that seemed like a pretty good time to do it, but there was still more going on. The leaders of the protest were going to court. The Canadian Parliament had an upcoming committee where members of government would testify under oath and present evidence to the country that the use of the Emergencies Act was valid. Canadian civil liberties groups had sued the government, and those cases were still ongoing. I kept watching, I kept collecting info, all of it with the intention of one day finally doing the trucker video. Eventually though, I just got lazy and played more video games. I played more Blueprints. I know most of the time the trucker video when stuff is said in good fun, but there's actually a fair number of former fans or hate watchers or whatever who are out there who think that I'm refusing to do the trucker video because it's so obvious that the truckers are correct that I won't be able to be a centrist and both sides it. Or they believe I'm afraid of the government, that I won't speak out because I don't want my bank account to be frozen by Trudeau the tyrant. Or they believe I actually support Trudeau, that I'm some progressive cuck who loves the boot and wants to see the truckers crushed under it. But none of that is true. Like I said, I'm just lazy, there's nothing more to it. As I said at the start, this video is about explaining to an outside audience Canada's slow decline over the past decade, covering multiple causes. Which means that although this isn't the full autistic trucker deep dive, I still want to talk about it, because it was probably the single most important political event in modern Canadian history. And although I intend to be as impartial as possible, I will plant my flag right now just to get it out of the way. I am what I guess you could call soft pro-trucker. Now to be clear, I'm not an anti-vaxxer or a COVID denialist. COVID is very real, I've had it myself, and I don't think the vaccines cause more damage than the virus. The three main vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, all went through phase 1, 2, and 3 trials throughout 2020 before being authorized for emergency use in the States by Donald Trump in December of that year. Initially, I actually agreed it was kind of spooky that this new tech arrived so fast and was being widespread pushed everywhere. The vaccine skeptics in those early months had a point, but time marched on, testing continued, and widespread adoption of the vaccine proved that any negative side effects were far less frequent and generally less damaging than COVID itself. When full authorization for vaccine use was granted in August of 2021, at that point, in the absence of any new major pieces of evidence swinging things the other way, continued vaccine skepticism just seemed to be conspiratorial nonsense. And despite this, I'm still soft pro-trucker, because although I'm not an anti-vaxxer and I generally believe everyone should get their shots, I also believe that making it illegal to refuse a vaccine is a gross violation of individual liberty, something that a liberal society should hold in high regard. In my opinion, the right thing to do is make the vaccine widely available, educate people on why they should get it, maybe even pay them to get it since you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, and then let people make their own choices. The trucker protesters themselves were far from perfect. In some ways, they were motivated by highly conspiratorial thinking, believing in nonsense that would later be proven false.
So there's one person that we follow here, the Tam chick, right? That and the Fauci in the States, right? And there's thousands of other.
But everybody, but what CEO of a hospital, what medical director of any province
paid? Why are they getting paid all this money for when people?
Do you think all these doctors and the Canadian Medical Health Association, they're all in on the conspiracy?
You think you need everybody? You just need the top people, and then it rolls down.
They're all bought. Okay, they're all bought.
There were also instances of violence committed by protesters towards both journalists and random Ottawa citizens filming their actions. There were also death threats from protesters towards members of parliament.
Trudeau, someone's gonna make you catch a bullet one day. To the rest of this government, someone's gonna fucking do yous in. You sons of bitches.
The only way that, and I'm going to say it out loud, the only way that this is going to be solved is with bullets.
And some of the funding of the event, especially with regards to its organizers, came from some pretty shady sources, and an extreme minority of people actually intended to commit terrorism and overthrow the government. However, it's also true that the vast majority of protesters, while disruptive and crude, were also overwhelmingly peaceful.
Well, guys, it's getting worse down here. Somebody bought Connect 4. This is big time. We need help! Help!
They set up bouncy castles and grills and hot tubs. They cheered and danced and sang. Optimus Prime even showed up. But most importantly of all, despite the presence of some conspiratorial nonsense, they were not motivated solely by conspiratorial nonsense. They had real grievances with regards to how the government had conducted the pandemic restrictions. Maybe it's not that well known, or maybe people have just forgotten, but Canada had some of the most restrictive pandemic measures in the entire world. And paradoxically, our restrictions got worse as the pandemic got better. Initially, unlike other countries with their 2 weeks to flatten the curve rhetoric, Trudeau was actually pretty honest about what we were in for.
Earlier today, we released our modeling on how we think this pandemic might unfold. The modeling shows that COVID-19 arrived in Canada later than in other countries. So we're in an earlier stage of the outbreak. That means we have the chance to determine what our country looks like in the weeks and months to come. Our healthcare systems across the country are coping for the time being, but we're at a fork in the road between the best and the worst possible outcomes. The best possible outcome is no easy path for any of us. The initial peak, the top of the curve, may be in late spring with the end of the first wave in the summer. As Dr. Tam explained, there will likely be smaller outbreaks for a number of months after that. This will be the new normal until a vaccine is developed. But as we saw, that is so much better than we could face, all of us, if we do not rise to the challenge of this generation. The path we take is up to us. It depends on what each of us does right now. It will take months of continued, determined effort. We'll need to keep practicing physical distancing, staying home, and washing our hands. It will help. It will help get the numbers that Dr. Tam was talking about, between 4,000 and 44,000 deaths, as low as possible.
And this is what became the pandemic social contract in Canada. There was this general sense among your average Canadian that while the lockdowns suck, we're going to pull together and do them until a vaccine's invented, because we don't want our vulnerable populations to get hurt. However, as the vaccines became more available, as Canadians began to take their shots throughout 2021, as vaccination rates improved, as deaths and hospitalizations decreased, as we began to reach the light at the end of the tunnel, both the federal and the provincial governments continually ramped up restrictions, rather than shuttering them as they initially promised. We actually had stricter lockdown measures when the Canadian population was 80% vaccinated than we had before the vaccine was even invented yet. Things boiled over when the government finally took it one step too far. This is, in my opinion, the event that caused the public to finally turn against COVID measures, and against the government more generally. This is the April 2021 Ontario police scandal. Even as vaccination continued to accelerate, the provincial government of Ontario announced this.
We have to do more. The reality is, there are few options left. We have implemented the strictest measures in all of North America. And the difficult truth is, every public health measure we have left comes with a massive cost to people and their lives. So effective immediately, we're extending the emergency declaration and prolonging the stay-at-home order province-wide. We have made the difficult but necessary decision to give police and bylaw officers special authorities to enforce public health measures for the duration of the stay-at-home order. I know that the majority of Ontario residents are doing the right thing. They're following the rules, keeping each other safe. But we need to step up enforcement. We need to focus on those who are deliberately putting others at risk by ignoring the stay-at-home order. Those gathering in large groups, continuing to put themselves and others at risk. So understand the restrictions will be strongly enforced because they must be.
We have made the deliberate decision to temporarily enhance police officers' authority for the duration of the stay-at-home order. Moving forward, police will have the authority to require any individual who is not in a place of residence to, first, provide their purpose for not being at home, and provide their home address. Police will also have the authority to stop a vehicle to inquire about an individual's reason for leaving their residence. I cannot stress this enough. It is imperative that everyone limit their trips outside of the home to permitted purposes only.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my question. I'm wondering about these new police powers to just randomly stop someone walking down the street or to pull over a car. What happens if a person refuses to answer the police questions?
Pass that to the Solicitor General.
So by issuing these new additional enforcement measures, it allows police officers to ask the person why they are not at their place of residence and what their place of residence is. And specifically to your question, if you are not willing to comply, then you are breaking the law. And there is an option for the police officer to issue a ticket.
How much is the ticket? And also, if someone sees their neighbors breaking these new regulations and having a party in their yard, that sort of thing. Should people call police on their neighbors?
So in terms of the ticket cost, that of course is set by the Chief Justice. Currently, if you break an order under the EMCPA, then it is $750, as I understand it. In terms of people calling to snitch, to inform, look, we all have a personal responsibility, and I would hope that the vast majority of us would take that personal responsibility seriously. If it means saving lives, then I think we have to think about what your social responsibilities are as an individual to make sure that you don't empower other people and invite a whole bunch of individuals to your home.
This was far beyond anything that had been done anywhere else in Canada, even in the exceptionally compliant Quebec. In Ontario, there was a total ban on all travel outside your house. Every single person was expected to stay inside in perpetuity unless they had explicit authorization to be outside, provided by a doctor or an essential workplace. And the police were empowered to stop anybody they saw and ask to see that authorization. When the dissident right began to talk en masse on social media about COVID Nazis who wanted to keep you locked down forever and forcing you to show your papers for travel, those conversations began around this time because they saw it actually happening in Ontario, and they believed this would be the first step towards the New World Order. Of course, it wasn't, and you can make a pretty good argument that the rightoids were just too conspiracy-brained. No state in America or country in Europe was getting ready to follow Ontario's lead if it worked out. And yeah, that's true, but you can also make the argument that the reason it utterly failed in Ontario and was immediately repealed after one day is due to a mass revolt by the entire province. I know that I personally went for a defiant walk around my neighborhood that day, which Lance called me an anti-vaxxer for. Pretty much everybody in Ontario who noticed what was going on, regardless of political affiliation, objected to this new policy. Journalists objected to it, doctors and scientists objected to it, and police departments across the province declared their intention to not enforce the order given by the provincial government. So, the next day, the plan was scrapped and the government apologized. But this attempt basically burned away any remaining goodwill that your average citizen had towards anything COVID-related. Vaccine rates were on the rise, but the popularity rates of lockdowns and restrictions began to fall. To put it bluntly, this was the moment, in Canada anyway, that large segments of the population began to lose trust in the government. Of course, this was the provincial government. It's not exactly fair to blame the federal government for this. And yeah, I agree. But at this point in America, lockdowns were largely a thing of the past, while confusion and stupidity continued to reign across Canada. As more and more Canadians began to lose faith in their government, beyond just the crazy anti-vax and anti-mask fringe, Trudeau started to paint everyone who objected or dissented with government mandates with the brush of that fringe group.
Mais il y a aussi des gens qui sont farouchement opposés à la vaccination. Qui sont extrémistes. Qui ne croient pas dans la science, qui sont souvent misogynes, souvent racistes aussi. C'est un petit groupe, mais qui prend de la place. Et là, il faut faire un choix en tant que leader, en tant que pays. Est-ce qu'on tolère?
Once again, I'll go into this in greater detail in the future. But basically, despite the pre-election Trudeau understanding the dangers of divisive, corrosive politics,
their instincts are now to be suspicious of people who do not share their beliefs, to harden divisions with people whose views differ from their own. Their approach to politics might work in the short term, but it is corrosive over time.
Everything that Prime Minister Trudeau did during the pandemic was far more divisive and corrosive than any of those conservatives he critiqued during that old clip. When the trucker protest kicked off in January of 2022, it was during a national conversation where mid-level cabinet members were quietly floating the idea of making it illegal to refuse to get vaccinated. Even people who had got all their shots began to turn on Trudeau and his government at that point. And all throughout the protest, Trudeau did what he always does: deflect, demonize, and double down. Though there were those bad actors in the protest, I genuinely believe that most of the rank and file would have simply left Ottawa and gone home had the government announced that the constant escalation of COVID measures was finally over. But instead, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act to clear the protest out. It's important to point out that while the Emergencies Act had never been used before, the legislation that it replaced, the War Measures Act, was used 3 times throughout Canada's history. The first time during the First World War, the second time during the Second World War, both of those uses are pretty self-explanatory, and the third time during the October Crisis. And yes, the October Crisis is kinda relevant in a roundabout way to this story. In October of 1970, the FLQ, a Quebec nationalist terrorist group, kidnapped the Labour Minister, Pierre Laporte, and a British ambassador, James Cross, in Montreal. They demanded the release of other FLQ members in exchange for the 2 men. Instead, the Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Trudeau, declared an emergency using the War Measures Act and sent the military into Quebec. Martial law was imposed across the province, and hundreds were detained during the resulting crackdown. In a now famous interview, the elder Trudeau is chided by media outside Parliament for his use of force, and he responds with what would eventually become his catchphrase.
Sir, what is it with all these men with guns around here?
Haven't you noticed?
Yeah, I've noticed them. Why you people decided to have them.
What's your worry?
I'm not worried, but you
so
seem
if you're
to
not
be.
worried, what's your... I know where
I'm worried about living in a town that's full of people with guns running around in it.
Are you? Have they done anything to you? Have they pushed you around or anything?
They've pushed around friends of mine.
Yeah? What were your friends doing?
Trying to take pictures of them.
Aha!
Is that against the law?
No, not at all.
Well, doesn't it worry you, having a town, that you've got to resort to this kind of thing?
No, it doesn't worry me. I think it's natural that if people are being abducted, that they be protected against such abduction.
But isn't that one of the...
Is your position that you should give in to the 7 demands of the FLQ and...
Not at all. My position is completely the opposite.
What is your position?
My position is that you don't give in to any of them.
All right. But you don't protect yourselves against the possibility of blackmail.
Well, how can you protect everybody that is going to be a possible target without a much bigger military force, without putting somebody on everybody in the country, turning it into almost a police state?
So what do you suggest? That we protect nobody?
How can you protect them all?
Well, you can't protect them all, but are you therefore arguing that you shouldn't protect any?
Well, that's right.
That's your position?
Right.
All right, so Pierre Laporte wasn't protected and he was abducted. If you had hindsight, would you not have preferred to protect him and Mr. Cross?
Well, it's second guessing is pretty easy, but you can't do it.
But I'm asking you the first guess now.
No, because it's impossible. With all the diplomats there are in this country.
Well, we got a big army.
You're going to use it up pretty fast at this rate.
What do you mean at this rate?
But what you're talking about, to me, is choices. Yeah. And my choice is to live in a society that is free and democratic, which means that you don't have people with guns running around in it.
All right,
and one of the things I have to give up for that choice is the fact that people like you may be kidnapped.
Sure.
Sir, if you had to right now...
but this isn't my choice, obviously. You know, I think it's more important to get rid of those who are committing violence against the total society and those who are trying to run the government through a parallel power by establishing their authority by kidnapping and blackmail. And I think it's our duty as a government to protect government officials and important people in our society against being used as tools in this blackmail. No, you don't agree to this, but I'm sure that, once again, with hindsight, you would have probably found it preferable if Mr. Cross and Mr. Laporte had been protected from kidnapping, which they weren't, because the steps we're taking now weren't taken. But even with your hindsight, I don't see how you can deny that.
No, I still go back to the choice that you have to make in the kind of society that you live in.
Well, there's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
Ultimately, only 2 people died during this event. Laporte was killed by the FLQ when he decided to try and fight his way out, and a random Canadian soldier accidentally tripped over his own gun and shot himself. But nonetheless, Pierre Trudeau's decisive action, as well as his willingness to hand back all emergency power after the crisis had passed, helped cement him in the minds of Anglo-Canadians as a strong, capable leader. Meanwhile, Franco-Canadian reaction was more mixed. Support for the FLQ and the Quebec militant cause dwindled away to nothing, but Quebecers were pretty shook after seeing tanks and soldiers occupy their cities and towns. Since the October crisis, no prime minister has ever broken the glass on emergency powers. And when one finally does it, it's the son of the last man who did it, who's been desperately trying to live up to his dad's enormous legacy the entire time, who even adopted his catchphrase, the one made famous by that very same crisis. Whenever I hear about American Democrats or left-wingers talk about the Canadian trucker protest, they often speak of it in the same breath as the January 6th riot. And I understand why. Both events are instances of a populist right-wing uprising against what they perceive to be a corrupt government. However, I personally don't think it's accurate to put these two events in the same basket. January 6th was an overwhelmingly violent riot that happened over the course of one day, where Congress was stormed due to the false belief that the election had been stolen from Donald Trump. And it was so incredibly explosive because, at least in part, a lot of right-wing talking heads had been riling people up for weeks beforehand. But the trucker protest is factually different. It was a highly disruptive, but generally peaceful occupation of downtown Ottawa. Of course, there were many instances of harassment and violence and threats. I'm not downplaying those, but I do want to point out that unlike January 6th, not once did the truckers try to storm the Parliament building, despite being camped outside of it for a month. And also, unlike January 6th, the truckers had clear grievances that were factually accurate, and they were objecting to things the government had actually done to them. I think it's far more appropriate to talk about the trucker protest in the context of something like Chaz. In fact, the truckers even hung up signs that were very reminiscent of Chaz. For those of you who don't remember, Chaz was the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. During the Summer of Love 2020, the Capitol Hill neighborhood in downtown Seattle was taken over by groups of BLM activists, Antifa, and other left-wing anarchists. The city government pulled back all policing and civil services from the zone, and the area was de facto a breakaway seditious territory for just under a month. I did a whole video detailing the rise and fall of Chaz if you're interested, but the point is, January 6th was a single riot that was extremely destructive to American political culture, and it demonstrated just how propagandized the right wing had become, while Chaz was a passive acceptance of left-wing anarchists carving off entire city blocks from the jurisdiction of the country for an extended period of time, during which the Democrat-controlled city and state failed to restore order and administer the area. While the trucker protest has some similarities with both of these events, in my opinion, the longevity, the loss of jurisdiction, and the fact they didn't attack the Parliament building makes it a lot more like Chaz than January 6th. The actual trucker video will still happen, even if it's largely irrelevant post-election, mainly because I've recorded hours of audio for it, and I don't want it to go to waste. There's still so much more to get into. The darker side of the truckers, the funding scandals, the government freezing bank accounts of private citizens, if they so much as bought a pro-trucker t-shirt, the attempts by Trudeau to make the emergency powers permanent, the court case that ruled Trudeau violated Canada's constitution, which is still working its way through appeals. But basically, the extremely heavy-handed way Trudeau approached the whole event was, in my opinion, his final nail in the coffin. The reason he held on to power for nearly 3 years afterward is simply because the NDP kept propping up his minority government. As soon as Pierre Poilievre became the leader of the Conservative Party, the general feeling around Justin Trudeau became very similar to how it felt during the end of Stephen Harper's term. Everybody knew he was on the way out, nobody really wanted him around anymore, and at that point we were all just waiting for the clock to run out and an election to be called. Funnily enough, Justin Trudeau was kind of like a progressive Donald Trump. Not nearly as extreme, obviously. For example, Trudeau never broke the law trying to steal an election like Trump did, which I explained in a previous video. But despite being the complete opposite of Trump in rhetoric, in tone, in how he carried himself, there are still similarities in how he governed. Both Trump and Trudeau are men of privilege. Neither of them built up a political career by working their way up the ranks. Both of them won their offices in the star power associated with their names. Both of them were elected by waves of populist fervor, one right-wing, the other left-wing. And once they were in office, both were utterly corrupt and self-serving, violating legal, precedential, and constitutional norms that prevented them from doing whatever they wanted. They gave favors to their friends, even if it was entirely unethical. They bent the rules of procedure as far as they could in order to hold on to power. They even punished dissenters with bogus lawsuits. Yeah, I didn't bring this up earlier because there was really no good way to fit it in. But when the Conservative leader at the time, Andrew Scheer, was criticizing Trudeau for one of his many corruption scandals, Trudeau had his personal lawyer threaten him with a libel suit.
I think it's important that all politicians be straight with Canadians in how they characterize their own actions and their own beliefs. I think we're going to have an election in the coming months. You can't be inventing things. You can't be lying to Canadians. And I think highlighting that there are consequences in short term and long term when politicians choose to twist the truth and distort reality for Canadians, it's not something we're going to put up with.
Just so we're clear, Trump's gone way further than Trudeau on pretty much every metric. And additionally, what he's doing during his second term is completely unacceptable. But my opposition to Trudeau isn't because he's this woke, progressive, far-left, suicidally empathetic cuck or whatever. That's really fucking cringe, and I hate listening to him talk. But his personal style isn't related to his policies. My objection to Trudeau is that he embodies all of the worst excesses of the Liberal Party in Canada. Gargantuan governments and budgets, bloated with waste, ideological blindness, demanding strict conformity and stifling dissent, and overwhelming amounts of corruption. All throughout this video, I've repeatedly made the point that Justin Trudeau and his government in Canada is in reality what the MAGA crowd falsely thinks the Democrat Party is in America. When MAGA paints their caricature of the American Democrats as being these far-left, revolutionary, communist, progressive whatevers, there's really only two things to say. One, their description of the Democrats is generally inaccurate. And two, if that description were true, it would be absolutely terrible to live under that administration. And in reality, outside of MAGA Fantasyland, they are actually describing what Justin Trudeau's administration has been like, where the American right has painted a straw man of the American left. The Liberal Party in Canada for the past decade has actually been that straw man. Trudeau never really recovered in popularity after the trucker protest and the resulting political fallout. The Conservatives enjoyed a slim lead in popularity, and after Poilievre took over as leader of the party, they began a steady climb. Americans, as well as Canadian leftists, like to call Poilievre Canada's Trump, which isn't all that accurate. Firstly, leftists in Canada call all Conservative leaders Canada's Trump, even when they're the most milquetoast loser candidate. The previous guy, Aaron O'Toole, was basically just a progressive, and he was still called Trump and Hitler and other nonsense.
I am an MP with a clear track record on standing up for human rights, whether it's women, whether it's the LGBT community. I won the leadership of the Conservative Party as a pro-choice Conservative MP, one that won with a strong mandate. That's how I'm going to lead as the leader of the opposition, and that's how I will be as Prime Minister. I'm in politics to defend the rights of Canadians, to secure a brighter future.
Showing that, at least in Canada, the far left will always call the Conservative leader a Nazi, regardless of what his actual policies are. But while Poilievre is certainly riding a wave of right-wing populism, the way a lot of other politicians across the world are right now, he's much more of an old-school, guns and weed and capitalism libertarian than he is a strict populist demagogue.
Now, it should go without saying that in a free country, professionals should not lose their jobs and licenses because they express a political opinion contrary to the licensing body that's mandated by the government. But, of course, in saying this, my liberal critics in the media will, of course, say, well, Poilievre agrees with freedom of speech for someone like Dr. Peterson, therefore he must endorse everything Dr. Peterson has ever said. Well, of course not. I don't endorse 100% of everything anyone has ever said. There's no two people in the world who agree 100% of the time on 100% of things. And so I'm sure there is something he's posted that I do object to, but that is not the point, because freedom of speech only matters when you disagree. I mean, if we all agreed, we wouldn't need freedom of speech because no one has ever tried to censor someone for saying something that they agree with. It is only when there is a disagreement that it matters. We're seeing the idea that someone can lose their job, their status, their ability to study because they express something that is contrary to the government line. Now, I don't believe that is the Canada we want. We have Section 2B of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. To be or not to be, that is the question. I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to my death your right to say it.
He's certainly fiery when he speaks, easily commanding crowds with his passionate appeals. But beyond tone, he doesn't really have that much in common with Trump, making him kind of the opposite of Trudeau in this regard. However, the general public in Canada linked the two together somewhat, which he was more than happy to play into. Everything was going swimmingly for him and the Conservatives, until Trump basically torpedoed the whole thing. After Trump won the 2024 election, he began threatening Canada and Mexico with tariffs. Trudeau met with Trump at Mar-a-Lago in late November 2024 and began negotiations to try and avoid a trade war. On December 13th, Trudeau told his longtime finance minister and deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, that he intended to replace her with Mark Carney. I don't think it's public why he wanted to make that switch. Maybe it's because Mark Carney has a long history of working in finance, and in the face of a trade war with the Americans, Trudeau wanted somebody with a bit more experience in the job. Regardless of reason, Freeland wasn't having it. Freeland was basically with Trudeau since the very beginning, performing multiple huge roles in his cabinet ever since 2015, earning her the nickname Minister of Everything. She was extremely loyal to him, standing by him during the SNC-Lavalin scandal, the trucker protest, an internal party revolt in October 2024 that went nowhere. Anytime something big happened, she was in the background, securing his power.
Because it's 2015.
And now she was the most important woman of all the women he had thrown under the bus. Trudeau wanted her to stay on in his cabinet in a different position, but instead she abruptly resigned, posting a scathing letter to social media, blasting Trudeau for costly political gimmicks during a looming trade war with the States. This was the final straw for Trudeau's support within his own party. He had managed to hold on to power through multiple scandals, purging dissenters repeatedly, but this time it was too much. Many Liberal MPs stated it was time for Trudeau to resign, while Freeland was given a standing ovation at a Liberal caucus meeting. There really seems to be a lot of bitterness from Freeland with regards to the whole affair, which I don't exactly blame her for.
How would you handle things differently? Like if your finance minister came to you and said, Prime Minister, I think we're on the wrong track here. How would you tackle that differently than what the experience you've had was?
Well, probably I wouldn't tell my finance minister I was going to fire her the day after she delivered the fall economic statement. I probably wouldn't say that 3 days before she was supposed to deliver it.
Mm-hmm. On January 6th, 2025, Trudeau announced he was stepping down as party leader. He also announced one final prorogation as a last fuck you in order to give his party time to run a leadership election. Of course, you're not supposed to prorogue Parliament because your party's in a crisis, but nobody really expects any better from Trudeau at this point.
Despite best efforts to work through it, Parliament has been paralyzed for months after what has been the longest session of a minority parliament in Canadian history. That's why this morning I advised the Governor General that we need a new session of Parliament. She has granted this request, and the House will now be prorogued until March 24th. Over the holidays, I've also had a chance to reflect and have had long talks with my family about our future. Throughout the course of my career, any success I have personally achieved has been because of their support and with their encouragement. So last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process. Last night, I asked the President of the Liberal Party to begin that process. This country deserves a real choice in the next election, and it has become clear to me that if I'm having to fight internal battles, I cannot be the best option in that election.
The two frontrunners in the Liberal leadership campaign were, unsurprisingly, Freeland and Carney. Carney was viewed as the outsider candidate, since he doesn't currently hold a seat in the House of Commons, and he had worked with Conservative Stephen Harper in the past, while Freeland had been loyal to Trudeau for a decade and was involved in everything he had done. This was an incorrect view of the two candidates, since Carney was chosen to replace Freeland in the 11th hour. He was the actual continuity candidate, but he was nonetheless seen as a fresh face and won an overwhelming majority. Ever since Trudeau's announcement that he was stepping down, the Liberals have skyrocketed in popularity, showing that maybe he was the anchor around their neck the entire time. While Poilievre's libertarian, down-to-earth, shoot-from-the-hip style that has helped him for years now has actually begun to hurt him, as Canadian voters view his perceived alignment with Trump as a major downside. You see, ever since Trump started the trade war with Canada and began saying that he wants to make Canada the 51st state and other nonsense like that, the Canadian public has overwhelmingly turned on Trump and the United States and anything remotely seen as Trumpian here at home, including Poilievre. Canadians are overwhelmingly boycotting American goods at rates that I haven't seen in, well, ever. Imagine being in Poilievre's shoes right now. You're the most popular Conservative leader in a generation, and you're slated to win big against a former progressive icon, now tarnished by scandal and hypocrisy. But because Trump's a retard, defeat is snatched away from the jaws of victory. Poilievre has to be beating his head against the fucking wall right now. Now, I don't know who's going to win the next election. Frankly, I would be happy with either Carney or Poilievre at this point, because at least neither of them are fucking Trudeau. The Trudeau years have been an unmitigated disaster for Canada, and I'm glad to see him go. And yet, I still have one tiny drop of sympathy for him. Yeah, he ruined the economy, he shredded the Canadian Constitution, he turned his back on all of his liberal principles, he pit Canadians against each other, and that's all pretty bad. But I have to remind myself of my earlier criticism of him. He's a himbo, he's a dilettante, he's not fit to rule. That made him a terrible ruler, sure, but it's kind of like, imagine if Paris Hilton was elected American president. Is Paris Hilton still the cultural go-to for a stupid rich girl nowadays? I don't know what Zoomers think. She was the quintessential idiot rich bimbo when I was younger. Maybe Kim Kardashian? Whatever. Imagine President Kardashian, someone even less fit to lead than Trump, because while I think Trump's pretty bad, he at least knows how to do some things, other than charge his phone, eat hot chip, and lie. And even though President Kardashian tries her best, she still ends up wrecking the country and breaking every law because she's an utterly incompetent 75 IQ rich girl whose entire personality is being attractive. And when she's finally tossed out of office, she'd likely cry, knowing that she had given it her best shot and failed. It wasn't the system that ruined her. It wasn't anybody else's fault. It was her reaching the limits of her own capability and understanding that she just was not enough. And that's what I see when I see that picture of Trudeau crying with the Governor General after he stepped down. A man who desperately tried to follow in his father's footsteps, but just was not enough. Also, Trudeau's a corrupt piece of shit. Bye!